A skull bears a wound no weapon can explain. A golden object carries a purpose nobody remembers. A settlement ends mid-sentence, leaving silence where thousands of voices once lived. 3 hours unfold like scattered pieces of a forgotten thought, each clue precise, each answer elusive, each discovery quietly unsettling. Stay close. On a cold November evening in 1718, the earth around the fortress of Fredriksten was dark, uneven, and scarred by weeks of military labor. Swedish soldiers worked in trenches beneath the fortress walls, exposed to enemy fire from the Norwegian defenses above. Among them stood King Charles XII of Sweden, a monarch who had spent much of his life on campaign. Then, as he leaned over the parapet to inspect the siege works, a projectile struck him in the head. Charles XII died almost instantly. The official account seemed straightforward. During the siege of Fredriksten in what is now southeastern Norway, Charles was overseeing Swedish operations against the fortress when a projectile entered the left side of his head and passed through the skull. The king was only 36 years old. His death abruptly ended a remarkable reign and removed the central figure from a conflict that had already exhausted Sweden. Yet the circumstances surrounding that fatal shot have continued to invite scrutiny. Charles XII had become one of Europe's most formidable military commanders. Ascending the Swedish throne at 15, he quickly found himself surrounded by enemies during the Great Northern War. Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, and Russia challenged Swedish power, while Charles responded with campaigns that carried his armies from northern Europe deep into the east. His victories became legendary, but so did the costs of prolonged warfare. By 1718, Sweden was under severe pressure. Charles hoped that capturing Fredriksten would force Norway to negotiate and strengthen his position. Instead, the campaign stalled. The trenches crept closer to the fortress. Winter approached, and Swedish soldiers faced difficult conditions. On the night of November 30th, Charles went forward to inspect the progress of the siege. A bullet or other projectile entered his skull. No dramatic final battle surrounded him. There was no duel, no visible attacker standing nearby. One moment, the king was alive. Moments later, Sweden's ruler lay dead in the darkness. That simplicity is precisely what made the case so enduring. Was Charles XII killed by Norwegian defenders firing from the fortress? That remains the conventional explanation. The Swedish king was exposed to enemy fire, and the trajectory of the wound could be consistent with a projectile coming from the Norwegian side. For centuries, this interpretation was accepted as the natural explanation for a monarch killed during an active siege. But another possibility emerged from the political atmosphere surrounding his death. Some contemporaries suspected that Charles had been assassinated by someone within his own ranks. The king had powerful enemies, and his military policies had produced deep frustration. Sweden's prolonged wars had drained resources and cost countless lives. His death could potentially benefit those who wanted an end to the conflict or a change in the direction of Swedish policy. The assassination theory became particularly compelling because of the uncertainty surrounding the projectile itself and the exact circumstances of the shooting. Over the centuries, Charles XII's remains were examined several times. His skull provided physical evidence that could be studied with methods unavailable to investigators in the 18th century. Modern examinations have generally supported the conclusion that the fatal injury was caused by a projectile, while questions about its precise origin have remained more difficult to settle. The angle of entry has been scrutinized. The location of the wound has been compared with the positions of Swedish and Norwegian forces. Even the possibility of a projectile fired from within the Swedish trenches has entered the discussion. Yet every interpretation encounters limitations. The battlefield was chaotic. Darkness obscured visibility. Soldiers were moving through narrow defensive works, and gunfire from the fortress made the environment exceptionally dangerous. Establishing the exact position of the king at the instant of impact is difficult centuries later, and so the image remains. Charles XII standing above the trench at Fredriksten, surrounded by darkness, artillery, and uncertainty. A projectile crosses the night, strikes the king, and changes the course of Swedish history. Was it an enemy shot fired from the fortress? A tragic accident? Or did someone closer to the king deliberately end his life? The surviving evidence cannot provide a definitive answer. And somewhere between the battlefield record, the forensic evidence, and the political tensions of 1718, the final moment of Charles XII remains suspended in uncertainty. And from the battlefield uncertainty surrounding Charles XII, we move to a far older landscape, where another puzzle survives not through written testimony, but through stone, ash, and the remains of a society whose story can only be reconstructed piece by piece. South of present-day Mexico City, the landscape rises gently above what was once the southern shore of Lake Xochimilco. Here stands Cuicuilco, an archaeological site whose most recognizable monument is unlike the stepped pyramids usually associated with Mesoamerica. Its great circular pyramid spreads outward in broad, rounded terraces, built from earth, stone, and layers of volcanic material. From a distance, it resembles a low mountain shaped deliberately by human hands. The structure is enormous, but its significance lies not only in its scale. Cuicuilco emerged as an important settlement long before Teotihuacan became a dominant center in central Mexico. Archaeological evidence indicates substantial occupation by the first millennium BC, with the site developing into one of the earliest major ceremonial centers in the region. Its inhabitants constructed monumental architecture, organized public spaces, and participated in agricultural and trade networks that connected communities throughout the basin of Mexico. At the center stood the circular pyramid. Unlike later pyramids with straight sides and sharply defined corners, Cuicuilco's principal monument follows a curved plan. Several terraces rise toward a flattened summit, where ceremonial activity once took place. Ramps and stairways provided access to the upper levels, while stone construction reinforced portions of the massive earthen core. Why was this particular form chosen? The most accepted explanation is practical and cultural. Circular architecture may have reflected local building traditions, religious symbolism, or an adaptation to the materials and techniques available to Cuicuilco's builders. Archaeologists have identified other circular structures in Mesoamerica, suggesting that the shape was not an isolated experiment. Yet, Cuicuilco presents another problem. Much of the settlement was eventually buried by volcanic activity. The eruption of Xitle, a nearby volcano, transformed the surrounding landscape sometime during the first centuries A.D. Lava spread across large areas, covering settlements, agricultural land, and architectural remains. The precise relationship between the eruption and Cuicuilco's decline has been debated, particularly regarding the timing and extent of abandonment. For generations, the volcanic landscape encouraged a simple interpretation. Cuicuilco was overwhelmed by nature, and its population was forced to relocate, but archaeological evidence suggests a more complicated sequence. Some areas appear to have been abandoned before the lava reached them, while other evidence indicates continued activity in parts of the region. Environmental disruption may have been significant, but it was not necessarily the sole factor behind Cuicuilco's decline. Changing trade networks, political competition, demographic movement, and the growing importance of other centers may all have contributed. Then there is the pyramid itself. Its circular design has sometimes inspired more speculative interpretations. Some have suggested that the monument reflects astronomical intentions or preserves a symbolic connection with volcanic landscapes. Others have proposed that its unusual form represents an architectural tradition that influenced later Mesoamerican ceremonial design. These ideas range from plausible cultural interpretations to theories that extend well beyond what the archaeological evidence can demonstrate. What can be established is already remarkable. Cuicuilco flourished centuries before some of the monumental traditions that later came to define central Mexico. Its builders possessed the organizational ability to create enormous ceremonial architecture. Yet the society they belonged to left no extensive written historical record comparable to those of much later Mesoamerican cultures. Today, the rounded terraces remain partially surrounded by the hardened remains of an ancient volcanic landscape. Stone walls, weathered surfaces, and excavated foundations offer fragments of a civilization whose development can be traced but never completely reconstructed. Perhaps the greatest question is not why Cuicuilco was circular, but how much of its meaning has disappeared with the people who built it. The pyramid still stands, but the intentions behind its form remain only partly understood, and beneath the layers of volcanic rock and archaeological evidence, there may still be details capable of changing how we understand one of the earliest monumental societies of central Mexico. From the volcanic terraces of Cuicuilco, our journey moves farther east, toward the tropical lowlands of the Malay Peninsula, where another archaeological puzzle emerges not from monumental temples, but from the remnants of an early maritime world. Near the modern town of Merbok in Kedah, Malaysia, the landscape appears deceptively quiet. Green vegetation covers low rises of earth, while narrow waterways lead towards the coast. Beneath this seemingly ordinary terrain lie the remains of Sungai Batu, a settlement complex that has transformed archaeological understanding of early trade and political organization in Southeast Asia. Among its most remarkable discoveries are structures interpreted as ancient port facilities, industrial areas, ritual buildings, and habitation zones. Archaeological investigations have uncovered brick foundations, furnaces, ironworking remains, and traces of activity extending over a surprisingly broad landscape. The evidence points toward a community deeply connected to maritime commerce. Radiocarbon dating from excavated materials has placed some activity at Sungai Batu as early as the first millennium BC, although the chronology and interpretation of individual structures remain subjects of continuing research. By the early centuries AD, the region appears to have participated in extensive networks linking the Malay Peninsula with India, the Bay of Bengal, and other parts of Southeast Asia. But what exactly was Sungai Batu? One interpretation sees it as part of an organized ancient port settlement associated with the wider trading landscape of Kedah. Its location near waterways and the coast would have provided access to maritime routes, while local resources offered opportunities for metal production and other industries. The remains of iron smelting furnaces are particularly significant. Hundreds of furnace-related structures have been reported across the archaeological landscape, suggesting that iron production was not a minor activity. Instead, it may have formed an important component of the settlement's economy. Ore could have been processed locally, while finished products or raw materials may have entered wider regional exchange networks. Yet, the scale of the site raises another question. How did such an extensive industrial and maritime complex operate in a period for which written records from the region are comparatively limited? The answer may lie in geography. The ancient coastline was not necessarily identical to the modern shoreline. Rivers, sedimentation, coastal change, and environmental transformation can alter the relationship between an archaeological site and the sea over centuries. Sungai Batu may once have occupied a more direct position within a maritime environment than the present landscape suggests. This possibility helps explain why port-related structures could now appear inland. Some researchers have proposed that the site represents an early urban or proto-urban center, challenging older assumptions that complex maritime societies in Southeast Asia developed primarily through later external influences. The archaeological evidence instead suggests that local communities were already organizing production, trade, and settlement on a substantial scale. More speculative interpretations go further. Some have portrayed Sungai Batu as evidence of a sophisticated regional kingdom whose influence extended far beyond what surviving records reveal. Others have suggested that its industrial activity points to a level of political organization comparable to much later states. Such claims remain difficult to establish conclusively. Archaeology can reveal furnaces, buildings, roads, ceramics, and patterns of settlement. It can show that people produced iron, exchanged goods, and maintained connections across considerable distances. But determining the exact political structure behind those activities is far more difficult. Perhaps that is what makes Sungai Batu so compelling. There are no monumental royal inscriptions explaining who controlled the port, no surviving chronicles describing its rulers, and no complete account of the merchants who passed through its waterways. Instead, there are fragments, brick platforms, industrial remains, pottery, charcoal, metalworking evidence, and traces of a settlement shaped by commerce and movement. Standing among these remains, the landscape seems almost too quiet for what it once represented. Ships may have arrived carrying unfamiliar goods. Metalworkers worked beside furnaces. Traders moved through waterways connecting inland resources with distant seas. And somewhere within this network, an organized community managed an economy whose full structure remains only partly visible. Was Sungai Batu simply one important trading and industrial center among many, or was it part of a larger political system whose reach has yet to be understood? The evidence continues to accumulate, but the complete story remains out of reach. And as excavation reveals more of this ancient port landscape, the unanswered question becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. How much of Southeast Asia's early maritime history still lies waiting beneath the earth? From the remnants of Sungai Batu, where archaeology gives us fragments of an early maritime world, we turn now toward a very different kind of historical puzzle. In rural Tennessee, a narrow opening in the limestone leads into darkness, carrying with it a story that has endured for more than 2 centuries. The Bell Witch Cave lies near Adams, Tennessee, in a landscape of fields, wooded hills, and limestone formations. Its entrance is modest. Beyond it, however, the passage descends into a network of cool, shadowed chambers shaped gradually by water moving through the rock. Today, the cave is closely associated with one of America's most enduring supernatural traditions, the story of the Bell Witch. The tale begins in the early 19th century when John Bell and his family lived on a farm in Robertson County. According to later accounts, the family began experiencing unusual disturbances around 1817. Objects were reportedly moved, unexplained noises were heard, and members of the household described physical attacks and encounters with an unseen presence. The story became increasingly elaborate as it was retold. According to tradition, the entity eventually identified itself as a spirit associated with a woman named Kate Batts, a former neighbor who had reportedly had a dispute with John Bell. The figure came to be known as the Bell Witch, and accounts attributed a remarkable range of phenomena to it. But where does documented history end and folklore begin? That question is central to the Bell Witch story. There is evidence that the Bell family existed, that John Bell lived in the area, and that the community remembered unusual events associated with the household. The earliest surviving written accounts, however, were produced after the events themselves, and many details became increasingly elaborate through later publications. One of the most famous claims concerns John Bell's death in 1820. Folklore states that he became severely ill under inexplicable circumstances, and that a strange bottle was discovered in the house. A local physician reportedly examined its contents, while later stories claimed that the substance was responsible for Bell's death. Such accounts are difficult to verify. There are no modern forensic records capable of establishing exactly what happened to him. Historical illness, poisoning, natural disease, and embellishment have all been considered in later interpretations. The absence of reliable contemporary documentation leaves considerable room for uncertainty. The cave became connected to the legend through later tradition, which holds that the Bell Witch appeared there, or that the cave formed part of the family's experiences. Visitors today can enter the passage and see the rock formations that became inseparable from the story. Inside, the atmosphere is naturally unsettling. Water has carved smooth surfaces through the limestone. Narrow passages open into larger chambers, while darkness absorbs sound in unusual ways. A distant movement of air can seem surprisingly close. A footstep can echo from an unexpected direction. Even without supernatural assumptions, caves possess physical properties that can distort perception. Could some experiences associated with the legend have originated from natural sounds, fear, suggestion, or misunderstood events? Certainly. Psychology provides several possible explanations for reported encounters with unseen presences. Once a community develops a shared expectation of supernatural activity, ordinary noises, shadows, illness, and coincidences can acquire extraordinary meaning. Stories may then reinforce one another with every retelling. Yet, the Bell Witch tradition has never depended entirely on one explanation. Some believers maintain that the reports represent genuine encounters with an unexplained entity. Others interpret the story as folklore shaped by social tensions, family conflict, and the storytelling traditions of rural Tennessee. Between those positions lies a wide range of possibilities, including exaggeration built around real but poorly documented incidents. The cave itself cannot settle the question. Its walls preserve geological history, not testimony. The family records that might clarify the original events are incomplete, while the most dramatic elements of the legend emerge through accounts written and repeated long after the supposed encounters. And so the Bell Witch Cave remains suspended between physical evidence and cultural memory. The darkness inside the cave is real. The Bell family was real. The reports of disturbances became part of the historical record. But the nature of whatever inspired those stories remains uncertain. Perhaps the enduring power of the cave lies precisely in that gap between what can be documented and what can only be reported. 2 centuries later, the question remains open. Was the Bell Witch story born from unexplained events, human imagination, or something that history has simply left beyond our ability to determine? Far from the crowded streets and modern towers, in the world of Japanese sword-making, there exists a blade whose proportions seem almost out of place among ordinary weapons. It stretches for nearly 4 meters from end to end, its curved steel body towering over a person standing beside it. Known as the Norimitsu Odachi, this enormous Japanese sword measures approximately 3.77 meters in length and weighs around 14.5 kilograms. It is traditionally dated to the 15th century. At first glance, it seems almost impossible that such an object could have belonged to a battlefield warrior. The familiar image of the samurai is one of controlled movement, speed, and precision. A sword had to be drawn, maneuvered, and used with enough efficiency to matter in combat. But the Norimitsu Odachi appears to challenge those assumptions simply by existing. Who would have carried something this large? And more importantly, was it ever intended to be carried at all? The answer begins with understanding what an Odachi actually was. The term generally refers to a large Japanese sword, sometimes associated with the word nodachi, or field sword. Unlike the shorter blades, most commonly associated with the samurai, odachi could reach extraordinary dimensions. Some were made for practical military purposes, while others appear to have served ceremonial, symbolic, or religious functions. That distinction is crucial, because although the Norimitsu sword looks like a weapon designed for a giant warrior, there is no reliable historical evidence that a giant samurai ever wielded it. Instead, its extraordinary size may tell us something more subtle about the society that produced it. In medieval Japan, swords were not simply tools of combat. They could embody status, religious devotion, craftsmanship, and political authority. Producing an unusually large blade required considerable quantities of metal, fuel, labor, and specialized knowledge. A sword of such dimensions could therefore function as a statement. It demonstrated what a swordsmith could accomplish. It demonstrated what a patron could afford, and it could transform the familiar symbol of the warrior into something almost monumental. The Norimitsu Odachi is attributed to a swordsmith named Norimitsu, although much of the surrounding history remains uncertain. Even the identity of the person or institution that commissioned it is not firmly established. That absence of information has helped turn the sword into something more mysterious than its physical dimensions alone would suggest. There is no clearly documented warrior standing beside it in a surviving battlefield account. No universally accepted record identifies its original owner, and no surviving testimony explains precisely why someone decided that a sword needed to be this large. That gap creates room for speculation. One possibility is that the blade was ceremonial. This is the explanation most consistent with the practical difficulties involved. A sword nearly 4 meters long would have been extraordinarily cumbersome for ordinary combat. Drawing it from a conventional scabbard would present obvious problems. Maneuvering it through confined spaces would be difficult. Carrying it over long distances would require considerable effort. Yet ceremonial objects do not have to be practical. They have to communicate meaning. Across many cultures, oversized weapons and tools were created precisely because their impracticality made them impressive. Their purpose was not necessarily to perform a task efficiently, but to make a statement about power, devotion, craftsmanship, or the importance of an occasion. The same principle could explain the Norimitsu blade. Perhaps its enormous dimensions were the message. But another possibility deserves consideration. Some exceptionally large Japanese swords may have been associated with battlefield use in specialized circumstances. Historical accounts indicate that very long blades existed during periods when warfare changed, and larger weapons could have particular advantages. Yet this does not mean that every enormous sword was swung like an ordinary katana. A weapon could be transported by one person and used by another. It could be carried ceremonially before troops. It could be mounted on a pole or displayed during religious processions. Or it could have been created primarily to inspire awe rather than inflict wounds. The distinction between weapon and symbol was not always as clear as modern observers might expect. And then there is the most persistent theory of all, the giant theory. Because when people encounter a sword nearly 4 meters long, one of the first thoughts is almost instinctive. Perhaps it belonged to someone enormous. Stories of giants have appeared in folklore around the world, and oversized weapons are sometimes drawn into those traditions. The Norimitsu Odachi has consequently been presented in modern fringe discussions as possible evidence of a giant warrior or an unknown race of unusually large humans. But the physical evidence does not establish such a conclusion. There is no verified archaeological discovery of a giant human associated with the Norimitsu sword. There is no reliable historical record describing a gigantic samurai who wielded it, and the existence of the sword itself does not require a giant owner. Human beings have always created objects larger than their practical needs. A ceremonial hammer can be too heavy for ordinary work. A monumental statue can tower over the people who carved it. A crown can be larger than any human head, and a sword can be made enormous without ever being intended for conventional combat. Still, dismissing the mystery entirely would be just as easy as exaggerating it. The more interesting question is not whether the sword belonged to a giant. It is why someone in 15th century Japan invested the resources and skill necessary to create something so extraordinary. Forging a blade of this size was not simply a matter of making everything larger. Japanese sword making depended upon carefully controlled processes involving heating, shaping, folding, hardening, and finishing. Producing a functional blade demanded technical knowledge. Scaling that process to extraordinary dimensions created additional challenges. The sword, therefore, represents something remarkable even without a supernatural explanation. It is evidence of what a skilled craftsman could attempt. And perhaps that is where the mystery becomes deeper. Because the sword survives, but the original intention behind it has largely disappeared. We can measure its length, we can weigh it, we can examine its construction, we can place it within the broader history of Japanese sword making. But the thought that existed in the mind of the person who commissioned it is far more difficult to recover. Was it made as an offering? Was it intended to symbolize military strength? Was it created to honor a deity, a shrine, or a powerful patron? Was it a demonstration of a swordsmith's extraordinary ability? Or was there another purpose that has simply vanished from the historical record? The absence of an answer is what gives the Norimitsu Odachi its peculiar presence. It does not need a giant warrior to become extraordinary. In fact, the more ordinary the explanation becomes, the more fascinating the human achievement may appear. A group of craftsmen in medieval Japan deliberately produced a blade almost 4 meters long, knowing that its dimensions would make it unlike nearly every ordinary sword around them. Somewhere behind that decision was a purpose, a ceremony, a patron, a belief, or perhaps simply an ambition to create something that would endure. And centuries later, the object remains, silent, measured, impossibly large beside the people who now stand before it. We know what it is made of. We know roughly when it was created. We can study the traditions that produced it, but the original reason for its existence remains less certain. Perhaps that is the enduring mystery of the giant samurai sword. Not who was large enough to wield it, but what message its makers believed such a colossal blade could carry. And somewhere between practical weapon, sacred object, and monument to craftsmanship, there may still be a purpose that the surviving evidence has not yet revealed. What was this enormous blade truly meant to represent? And what might still be missing from the story of the people who forged it? And just as an enormous sword can raise questions about the people who created it, sometimes a far smaller object can create an even deeper uncertainty. A tiny figure, no more than a few centimeters long, can survive for thousands of years and leave behind almost nothing else to explain why it was made. In the late 19th century, near the small community of Nampa, in what is now southern Idaho, workers drilling a well encountered something that would become one of the most controversial artifacts in the history of American archaeology. It was a miniature human figure. The object was made of baked clay and measured only a few centimeters in length. Its surface appeared to preserve details resembling a human body, a head, torso, limbs, and other features. But the circumstances surrounding its discovery were extraordinary. The figurine was reportedly brought to the surface from deep underground, from material associated with deposits said to be far older than conventional explanations for human occupation in the region would allow. And that was where the mystery began. If the object really came from the depth claimed by the men who discovered it, what could that possibly mean? The Nampa Figurine emerged in 1889 during drilling operations conducted by the East Line Irrigation Company. The well was being sunk through layers of sediment in search of water. According to contemporary accounts, workers used a sand pump to bring material upward from considerable depth. At some point, the tiny figure appeared among the material being recovered. One of the men involved in the operation, Willard F. Libby, later became associated with accounts of the discovery. The artifact eventually came into the possession of geologist Albert A. Wright, who described it and argued that its circumstances were significant. The story quickly attracted attention. At the time, questions surrounding the antiquity of human beings in North America were already intensely debated. Discoveries suggesting very ancient human occupation were often met with skepticism, while others were promoted as evidence that the accepted timeline was incomplete. The Nampa figurine entered that debate in an unusual way. Its significance did not come primarily from the figure itself. It came from where it was said to have been found. The reported depth was approximately 300 feet, although the exact geological context has been disputed. If the figurine truly originated from sediments deposited at such an ancient geological age, it would imply something extraordinary: that an object resembling a deliberately manufactured human figure existed in North America vastly earlier than accepted archaeological evidence permits. But there is a fundamental problem. The archaeological context was never securely documented according to modern standards. There was no controlled excavation. No carefully recorded stratigraphic profile accompanied the object. The drilling process itself disturbed the sediments as material was brought upward through a narrow borehole. Establishing exactly which geological layer produced a particular object under those circumstances is extremely difficult. This distinction matters. An artifact can be genuinely old without necessarily being as old as the sediment from which someone claims it emerged. And the Nampa figurine has never been accepted by mainstream archaeology as evidence for extremely ancient humans in North America. Yet the object itself remains interesting. Its small size and crude appearance have generated different interpretations. Some observers have considered it a genuine prehistoric figurine, perhaps produced by people living in the region during a much later period. Others have questioned whether it is actually ancient at all. There is also the possibility that the object entered the well shaft accidentally. Perhaps it was introduced into disturbed material. Perhaps it originated from a more recent archaeological layer. Or perhaps the original story surrounding its discovery became distorted as it passed from witnesses to collectors, researchers, newspapers, and later writers. These explanations require no unknown civilization. They require only something much more common in archaeology: an incomplete chain of evidence. But the Nampa figurine has attracted another category of interpretation. Some writers have suggested that its reported geological depth could indicate an extremely ancient human presence in North America. Others have connected it to broader theories of forgotten civilizations, prehistoric migrations, or even cultures supposedly existing far earlier than conventional archaeology allows. A few fringe interpretations go further still, proposing that the figure represents evidence of an advanced or unknown population whose existence has disappeared from the archaeological record. There is no reliable evidence supporting those claims, but the reason they continue to appear is understandable. The figurine occupies an unusual position between object and story. If it were recovered during a modern excavation with secure documentation, its meaning would be much easier to assess. If it were clearly identified as a recent object, the mystery would largely disappear. Instead, its history depends heavily upon 19th-century reports describing a discovery made under difficult circumstances. That leaves us with a problem that has confronted archaeologists for generations. How much confidence should we place in an artifact when its physical existence can be examined, but its original archaeological context cannot be independently reconstructed. The figurine itself has been studied and discussed for more than a century. Its unusual form has invited comparisons with prehistoric figurines from other parts of the world, although such comparisons do not establish a connection. Its small scale is not inherently mysterious. Humans have created miniature representations of themselves for thousands of years. The real difficulty lies elsewhere. The figure appears ordinary enough to be ancient. Its supposed geological context is what makes it extraordinary. And those two pieces of the story may not belong together. Imagine the drilling site in Idaho in 1889. The landscape is quiet. The machinery works downward through layers of earth that no one at the time can see. Sediment is lifted from below the surface, mixed and disturbed by the drilling process. Then, among the material brought upward, someone notices a tiny human form. There would have been no way for the workers to know precisely how long that object had been underground. No modern dating laboratory, no digital geological survey, no archaeological excavation surrounding the discovery. Only the object, the well, the witnesses, and their descriptions. From there, the story entered the historical record. And once a discovery becomes famous, separating the original event from later interpretation can become remarkably difficult. Perhaps the figurine was genuinely ancient, but its depth was misunderstood. Perhaps it belonged to a much later prehistoric culture. Perhaps it was introduced into the well through some unknown disturbance. Or perhaps the 19th century accounts preserved a genuine discovery whose geological circumstances can no longer be reconstructed with confidence. The most radical theories ask whether the figurine could represent a civilization far older than accepted evidence allows. The more conventional explanation asks a simpler question. Is there enough evidence to make such a claim? At present, there is not. Yet the object remains a fascinating reminder of how fragile archaeological evidence can be. A tiny figure can survive beneath the earth for centuries or millennia, while the information needed to explain it disappears almost completely. The Nampa figurine therefore leaves us with two separate mysteries. There is the mystery of the object itself. Who made it, when, and for what purpose? And there is the mystery of its discovery. How did it come to be associated with sediments hundreds of feet beneath the surface? The first questions may someday be answered through new analysis of the artifact and its materials. The second may be far more difficult, because the earth remembers its layers, but human records do not always preserve how those layers were disturbed. And somewhere beneath the surviving reports, between geology and memory, may lie the missing piece that could finally explain how a tiny human figure came to emerge from the depths of Idaho. Until that evidence is found, the Nampa figurine remains suspended between archaeology and legend, a small object carrying a remarkably large question. Was it simply a misunderstood prehistoric artifact, displaced by the circumstances of an early drilling operation? Or does its story still conceal something about the earliest chapters of human presence in North America that we have yet to uncover? The room is gone, but its absence has become almost as famous as its existence. Inside Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, near what is now St. Petersburg, the Amber Room once surrounded visitors with a warm golden glow. Panels of amber covered the walls in intricate patterns, framed by gilded carvings, mirrors, mosaics, and decorative elements that transformed the fragile fossilized resin into something resembling a chamber made from sunlight. It was not an ordinary room. The original panels had been created in Prussia during the early 18th century, incorporating thousands of carefully cut pieces of amber into elaborate compositions. In 1716, Prussian King Frederick William I presented the Amber Room to Russian Tsar Peter the Great. It was later installed and expanded at the Catherine Palace under Empress Elizabeth, eventually becoming one of the most celebrated interiors of Imperial Russia. For generations, it remained there. Then came the war. In 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union. As the front moved toward Leningrad, the treasures of the Catherine Palace faced destruction, looting, and removal. Soviet curators attempted to protect the palace collections. But the amber room presented a particular problem. Amber is fragile. The elaborate panels could not simply be removed like ordinary paintings or furniture. According to accounts from the period, attempts were made to conceal the room beneath wallpaper, hoping this would prevent German troops from recognizing its importance. It did not work. German soldiers discovered the amber room and dismantled it. The panels were packed into crates and transported away. In November 1941, they were installed at Königsberg Castle in East Prussia, where the room was put on display. For a brief period, the amber room had a new location, and then, once again, history moved beneath it. By 1944, the war was turning against Germany. Soviet forces were advancing westward, while Königsberg was increasingly threatened. The castle and its surroundings became a battlefield. The amber room was dismantled again. Crates were reportedly moved from the castle. But what happened after that remains uncertain. This is where the historical trail begins to fragment. There are records indicating that some components were transported. There are wartime testimonies, inventories, photographs, and reports. But there is no universally accepted chain of evidence showing exactly where the original amber room ended its journey. By the end of the war, it had disappeared. The most straightforward explanation is also the most tragic. The amber room may have been destroyed during the fighting around Königsberg. The city suffered enormous bombardment, and the castle itself was badly damaged. Fire, explosions, collapsing structures, and subsequent destruction could have consumed or buried the panels. If that happened, there may be nothing left to find. Yet, the mystery persists because the surviving evidence does not provide a definitive answer. Some reports suggest that the room's components were removed before the castle was destroyed. Others describe crates being loaded onto ships or transported by land. Several witnesses later claimed knowledge of hidden storage locations. Over the decades, investigators have followed these leads into mines, tunnels, bunkers, forests, abandoned buildings, and the waters of the Baltic Sea. One of the most famous theories places the amber room aboard a ship that disappeared in the final months of the war. Another points toward underground complexes where German authorities allegedly concealed valuable objects as Allied and Soviet forces approached. Some searches have produced intriguing discoveries, but none has recovered the complete original amber room. That distinction is important, because fragments of amber, decorative objects, and other wartime treasures have been found in various locations, but finding amber does not automatically establish a connection to the missing chamber. Amber was widely used in European decorative arts, and countless pieces existed independently of the amber room. Still, one discovery came remarkably close to changing the story. In 1997, a German soldier's family returned a surviving Florentine mosaic that had originally belonged to the amber room. The mosaic had apparently been taken from Königsberg near the end of the war. Its recovery proved something significant. At least one component of the original room had survived the disappearance. But it also raised another question. If one piece had survived, what happened to the others? Could more fragments still exist somewhere? Or had the rest been destroyed? The search became even more complicated because the amber room was not simply a collection of loose objects. Its panels had been assembled into a carefully designed architectural interior. Removing them, transporting them, storing them, and later reconstructing them would have required specialized knowledge. That creates an unusual possibility. Perhaps the room was never lost as a single object. Perhaps it was broken apart. Individual panels could have been separated, sold, hidden, damaged, or incorporated into private collections. If so, searching for a single hidden chamber might be the wrong approach entirely. The missing room could exist only as scattered fragments. This possibility has encouraged countless investigations. Some researchers have explored German underground complexes, particularly those connected with wartime storage. Others have searched shipwrecks in the Baltic. Still others have investigated claims involving private collections and objects that appeared decades after the war. And then there are the more speculative theories. Some suggest that the Amber Room was deliberately hidden in a secret location known only to a small group of German officials. Others propose that it was transported far from Königsberg and eventually ended up in an unknown private collection. There have even been theories involving secret wartime networks, undisclosed caches, and objects supposedly removed from Europe after the conflict. None has produced conclusive evidence for the complete room. The mystery is therefore not simply about treasure. It is about documentation. Wars destroy records as efficiently as they destroy buildings. People disappear. Testimonies conflict. Names are forgotten. Objects change hands without inventories. A crate that was carefully recorded in 1 month can become an unexplained absence the next. And the Amber Room existed at precisely the wrong moment in history. It was dismantled during one of the most chaotic periods of the 20th century, moved across a landscape collapsing under military pressure, and last clearly documented in a city that was itself being destroyed. Perhaps the most frustrating clue is that the Amber Room was so distinctive. It was enormous in cultural value and visually unmistakable. A complete room covered in amber panels would be difficult to hide permanently. Yet individual pieces would be another matter. A panel could be concealed. A mosaic could be carried away. A fragment could pass from one collection to another without its origin being recognized. And if enough pieces were separated, the identity of the original room could gradually disappear. In the decades after the war, Soviet authorities eventually abandoned the hope of recovering the original chamber. Instead, an extraordinary reconstruction project began. Using surviving photographs, drawings, measurements, and historical descriptions, craftsmen recreated the Amber Room at Catherine Palace. The reconstruction was completed and opened to visitors in 2003. Today, a magnificent Amber Room can once again be seen there. But it is not the original. The distinction gives the chamber an almost haunting quality. Visitors can stand beneath the amber panels and see what the Imperial Room once looked like. Yet, somewhere beyond the reconstructed walls lies an unresolved historical question. What became of the original? Was it destroyed beneath the ruins of Königsberg Castle? Did fire consume the delicate amber? Were the panels buried in an underground storage site that has never been identified? Did some survive in crates that were never recovered? Or were individual pieces scattered across Europe, their origins forgotten as generations passed? The reconstructed chamber tells us what was lost. The surviving evidence tells us that at least some pieces escaped the destruction. But between those two facts lies a gap of more than 8 decades. And somewhere within that gap, the final fate of the original Amber Room remains hidden. Perhaps one day a forgotten inventory, a private collection, an archaeological excavation, or an unexplored wartime site will reveal another fragment. And perhaps that fragment will finally point toward the rest. Until then, the Amber Room remains one of history's most elusive disappearances, not because nobody knows where it once stood, but because we know exactly what it looked like. Know that it was dismantled. Know that pieces survived, and still cannot say with certainty where the greater part of it went. The room disappeared. Its reconstruction returned, but the original remains somewhere between memory, ruins, and evidence yet to be found. High above the surrounding landscape of West Lothian, Scotland, a broad hill rises gently into the sky. From its summit, the land seems to unfold in every direction. fields, distant hills, and the faint outline of settlements far below. But beneath the grass of Cairnpapple Hill lies evidence of something much older than the landscape visible today. At first glance, the summit appears almost ordinary. There are no towering walls like those of a medieval fortress. No massive stone gateway announces an ancient stronghold. Yet archaeological investigations have revealed that this quiet hilltop was repeatedly used by people for thousands of years. Cairnpapple Hill is not simply a fort. It is a place where different generations appear to have returned, rebuilt, buried, gathered, and perhaps performed ceremonies across an extraordinary span of time. And that raises a question that becomes more intriguing the longer we examine the site. What was it about this particular hill that kept drawing people back? The earliest known activity at Cairnpapple dates to the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the appearance of written records in Britain. Archaeological excavations uncovered evidence of ceremonial activity, including a large circular arrangement associated with prehistoric gatherings. The summit was not chosen randomly. Its elevated position provided an exceptional view across the surrounding countryside. From here, the horizon becomes part of the monument itself. For prehistoric communities, elevation may have carried practical significance. A hilltop offered visibility, a recognizable landmark, and a place where groups could gather away from everyday settlements. But it may also have held symbolic importance. The people who constructed monuments across prehistoric Britain repeatedly selected prominent locations. Hills, ridges, valleys, springs, and natural formations could become places where the boundaries between landscape, community, and belief were expressed. At Cairnpapple, this relationship seems particularly strong. Archaeologists discovered evidence of a prehistoric burial monument at the summit, including a central stone feature surrounded by a circular enclosure. Human remains were also recovered, indicating that the hill was connected with funerary practices. The exact meaning of those activities is impossible to reconstruct completely. Were the dead buried here because the summit was regarded as sacred? Were ceremonies performed to mark particular seasonal events? Did the monument serve as a meeting place for several communities? Or did its meaning change repeatedly as different generations inherited the site? Perhaps all of these possibilities played a role. What makes Cairnpapple especially fascinating is the length of time over which people continued to use the summit. The site was not frozen in a single prehistoric moment. It evolved. Later, prehistoric communities returned to the hill, leaving additional structures and evidence of activity. During the Bronze Age, the character of the site appears to have changed, with new burial practices and monuments being introduced. Then, much later, the hill became associated with defensive activity. The word fort can therefore be misleading if we imagine a single ancient fortress standing here continuously through history. Cairnpapple Hill is better understood as a landscape repeatedly transformed by different communities. At some stage during the Iron Age, defensive structures were established around the summit. Archaeological evidence indicates the presence of a hill fort, with banks and ditches defining parts of the elevated enclosure. By this period, Britain had changed considerably. Communities were living within increasingly complex social systems. Competition for land and resources could make defensible positions valuable. Hill forts appear throughout Britain, although their precise functions varied from place to place. Some may have served as settlements. Others may have been gathering places, centers of authority, or refuges during periods of conflict. A few may have combined several roles. Cairnpapple may have done the same. Yet its earlier ceremonial history complicates any simple interpretation. Why build a defensive enclosure around a place that had already been important for generations? Was the hill chosen for defense because it was already culturally significant? Or did its strategic position independently make it attractive? The answer may lie somewhere between symbolism and practicality. From the summit, visibility is one of the site's most striking features. A person standing here could survey a remarkable portion of the surrounding landscape. That would have been useful for observation, but visibility also has symbolic power. A monument on a high hill can be seen from far away, turning the landscape itself into a kind of message. Perhaps Cairnpapple was meant to be noticed. Perhaps its builders understood that placing structures on the summit made the hill a permanent marker of identity. There is another possibility. The repeated use of the site may indicate that later communities recognized and inherited an older sacred landscape. We know from archaeological evidence that prehistoric monuments were sometimes revisited long after their original construction. People could encounter ancient burial mounds and stone circles whose creators were already forgotten, yet still treat those places as meaningful. Could Cairnpapple have been one of these locations? A place remembered not through written history, but through the physical presence of monuments left by ancestors. The deeper we look, the more the hill begins to resemble a layered historical record. Beneath one structure lies another. Beneath defensive banks are traces of earlier activity. Burial practices appear alongside ceremonial arrangements, and later generations modified the summit without necessarily erasing everything that came before. It is almost as though each community added its own chapter to a story it could never fully read. Modern archaeology has revealed many of these layers, but archaeology also exposes the limits of what can be known. We can identify stone settings. We can date charcoal and organic remains. We can analyze burial evidence. We can reconstruct the shape of banks and ditches. What we cannot easily reconstruct is intention. A stone circle does not tell us what the people standing inside it believed. A burial does not explain the rituals that surrounded it. A fortification does not tell us whether people lived there permanently or gathered there only during particular circumstances. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some have imagined Cairnpapple as an astronomical center, suggesting that its elevated position in prehistoric structures may have been connected to observations of the sun, moon, or seasonal cycles. Such ideas are not impossible. Prehistoric monuments elsewhere in Britain demonstrate that communities could have sophisticated relationships with celestial movements, but direct evidence for a precise astronomical function at Cairnpapple is limited. Other interpretations emphasize the site's possible religious significance, imagining ceremonies involving burial, ancestors, seasonal gatherings, and communal identity. Again, the archaeological evidence makes ceremonial activity plausible, but it cannot reveal the beliefs behind it with certainty. The danger is always the same. When the evidence becomes silent, imagination can easily begin speaking for it. Cairnpapple does not need an extraordinary explanation to be remarkable. Its real mystery is already embedded in the archaeological record. For thousands of years, people returned to the same summit. They buried their dead here. They constructed monuments. They gathered here. Later communities reshaped the landscape and established defensive structures. The purpose changed, but the hill remained important. Why? Perhaps the answer lies in geography, perhaps in memory, perhaps in religion, or perhaps the hill's significance emerged from all three. Today, the summit is quieter. The structures are fragments, banks, stones, depressions, and archaeological traces. Yet, standing there, it is possible to sense why the location might have mattered. The horizon is enormous. The hill rises above the surrounding land, and beneath the ground are traces left by people who stood on this same summit thousands of years ago, looking outward at a landscape they knew intimately, but which has now been transformed. They left no written explanation. No inscription tells us what ceremonies took place here. No surviving account identifies the people who first decided that this hill was special. All that remains is the physical evidence. And perhaps that is what makes Cairnpapple Hill so compelling. It was not one mystery created at one moment. It was a place repeatedly chosen by people whose worlds were separated by centuries, perhaps millennia. Each generation seems to have seen something worth preserving in this summit. The fort may explain one chapter, the burials another, the prehistoric monuments another. But the larger question remains. What did they all see in Cairnpapple Hill that we can no longer see? And beneath the surviving stones and earthworks, could there still be traces of an earlier purpose waiting to reveal why this isolated summit became a place of ceremony, burial, gathering, and defense for so many generations? On a low hill overlooking the Ela Valley, the landscape of the southern Levant stretches beneath the open sky. The hills are dry and rugged, broken by fields, terraces, and narrow valleys that have carried people, armies, and traders for thousands of years. Here, on the summit of a modest rise, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a fortified settlement that had been almost forgotten. Its name is Khirbet Qeiyafa. At first, there is little about the site to suggest that it would become one of the most debated archaeological discoveries of its period. There are walls, houses, pottery fragments, storage installations, and the remains of an ancient settlement. But then the dates begin to matter. Khirbet Qeiyafa appears to have been occupied for a relatively short period around the late 11th or early 10th century BC, before being abandoned. That places it at a critical moment in the history of the southern Levant, when small kingdoms and emerging political centers were developing across a landscape divided among different peoples and communities. And almost immediately, a question emerged. Who built this fortified town? The site was excavated beginning in the late 2000s, and the discoveries quickly attracted international attention. One of its most striking features is the massive defensive wall surrounding the settlement. The fortification system included 2 monumental gates, an unusual feature for a site of this size. The settlement itself appears to have been carefully planned, with buildings constructed against the defensive wall and an internal layout suggesting organized occupation. Radiocarbon dating of organic remains placed the main period of occupation around the beginning of the 10th century BC, broadly within the early Iron Age. That was significant. The dating placed Khirbet Qeiyafa within a period associated with major changes in the region's political and social organization. Some researchers argued that the site's fortifications and planning were evidence of an early centralized kingdom. Others were more cautious. Could a relatively small settlement really tell us about the existence of a larger political state? Or might Khirbet Qeiyafa have been constructed by a local community whose organization had nothing to do with a centralized monarchy? The debate became even more complicated because of the site's location. Khirbet Qeiyafa sits overlooking the Ela Valley, a natural corridor connecting the coastal plain with the interior highlands. In ancient times, controlling such a route could have strategic importance. A settlement on the hill could monitor movement through the valley and protect access between different regions. That makes a defensive explanation perfectly reasonable. But strategic geography does not identify the people who occupied the site. And this is where the mystery begins to deepen. One of the most important discoveries at Khirbet Qeiyafa was a small inscription found on a pottery fragment. Known as the Qeiyafa ostracon, the inscription is written in an early form of alphabetic script and dates to approximately the same period as the settlement. Its interpretation remains debated. The text is damaged and difficult to read, and scholars have proposed different translations and meanings. Some interpretations suggest that it contains language associated with justice, social responsibility, or administrative authority. Others have emphasized that the text may be a more ordinary administrative or literary document. Whatever its exact meaning, the inscription demonstrates that writing was present at the settlement during its occupation. And that matters because written evidence from this period is relatively scarce. A few lines scratched onto pottery can suddenly transform an archaeological site from a collection of stones into something more personal. Someone held the object. Someone wrote those signs. Someone expected another person to understand them. But who? The inscription does not provide a simple answer. Some scholars have argued that the site was associated with an early Judahite kingdom. Others have suggested that it may have been connected with the Philistines, Canaanite populations, or another local group. The architecture has been compared with features associated with several cultural traditions, while the pottery assemblage has produced arguments in different directions. This is a familiar problem in archaeology. Material culture does not always fit neatly into modern categories. People traded. They migrated. They borrowed architectural styles. They adopted writing systems. They lived beside neighboring communities. A wall may look one way while the pottery inside it tells another story. Khirbet Qeiyafa, therefore, sits at an uncomfortable intersection. Its defensive architecture suggests organization. Its location suggests strategic importance. Its inscription suggests literacy. Its short occupation suggests a period of intense activity followed by abandonment. But the identity of the people who created this combination remains contested. There is another feature that has drawn attention. The settlement appears to have been constructed according to a coherent plan. Houses were arranged along the defensive perimeter, and the two gates created controlled access points. For some researchers, this level of planning points toward centralized authority. If large quantities of labor were needed to construct the fortifications quickly, who organized that labor? Who supplied the materials? Who decided where the walls should stand? And why was so much effort invested in a settlement that seems to have existed for only a short time? Perhaps the answer was military. Maybe Khirbet Qeiyafa was built during a period of regional conflict when controlling the valley became essential. Perhaps it was a frontier settlement. Perhaps it served as a temporary strategic stronghold. Or perhaps its apparent sudden construction reflects a larger political transformation taking place across the region. The more speculative interpretations go further. Some have suggested that Khirbet Qeiyafa could provide archaeological support for traditions concerning the early monarchy described in later biblical texts. Others have treated the site as evidence for a much more developed, centralized state during the early 10th century BC. But archaeology cannot simply confirm a historical narrative because a site happens to fit a particular date. The evidence has to stand independently. And the evidence from Khirbet Qeiyafa remains open to interpretation. Even the site's abandonment raises questions. After only a relatively brief period of occupation, the settlement appears to have been deserted. There is evidence of destruction, although the precise circumstances remain debated. Was the settlement attacked? Was it deliberately dismantled? Did political conditions change? Did the strategic importance of the site disappear, or was the community simply moved elsewhere? An abandoned settlement can be more mysterious than a destroyed one. When people leave, they take most of their lives with them. What remains is what they could not carry, what they discarded, what they buried, and what the earth preserved. At Khirbet Qeiyafa, those remnants provide a remarkable snapshot of a society at a moment of transformation. There are houses, storage jars, cooking vessels, defensive walls, 2 monumental gates, and a small piece of pottery bearing writing whose precise meaning remains disputed. Together, these clues suggest an organized community capable of substantial construction. But they do not give us a complete identity. This is where fringe theories sometimes enter the discussion. Because the site is associated with an important period of regional history, some interpretations have attempted to make it direct evidence for particular rulers or events described in later traditions. Yet no inscription naming a king has been found. No document explicitly identifies the settlement's political allegiance. No single artifact resolves the debate. The most responsible interpretation is therefore more restrained. Khirbet Qeiyafa was a fortified early Iron Age settlement in a strategically important location, occupied for a limited period around the late 11th to early 10th century BC. Beyond that, the picture becomes less certain, and perhaps that uncertainty is precisely what makes the site valuable. It allows us to see history before later traditions have completely organized it for us. The people who lived here did not leave behind a narrative explaining themselves. They left structures. They left objects. They left a few written signs. And they left a hill overlooking a valley that has changed dramatically since their time. Today, the walls are silent. The gates no longer control movement through the valley. The houses no longer contain voices. But the questions remain. Who ordered the walls to be built? Why did this settlement appear so suddenly? What political force stood behind its construction? Why was it abandoned after such a short existence? And what did the writer of the small inscription actually intend to say? Perhaps future excavations will reveal another inscription, or an undiscovered structure that changes the picture entirely. Perhaps the competing interpretations will eventually converge. Or perhaps Khirbet Qeiyafa will remain what it is today, a rare archaeological window into a poorly documented period, offering enough evidence to illuminate the past while withholding just enough to keep its deepest questions alive. Because sometimes the most revealing ruins are not the ones that give us answers. They are the ones that show us exactly how much of the past is still missing. And beneath the stones of this quiet hill above the Ila Valley, there may still be another piece of that missing story waiting to be uncovered. Along the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, where the waters of the ancient harbor once carried ships from distant lands, a city rose that became one of the intellectual centers of the ancient world. Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, the city developed into a vast meeting place for merchants, scholars, engineers, physicians, philosophers, mathematicians, and travelers. Its streets connected Egypt with the wider Mediterranean, while its institutions attempted something even more ambitious, to gather the written knowledge of the known world into one place. At the heart of that intellectual ambition stood the Library of Alexandria, or perhaps, more accurately, the libraries and scholarly institutions associated with the royal court and the Museum. For centuries, Alexandria became almost synonymous with knowledge itself. Scrolls arrived from distant ports, texts were copied, scholars debated difficult questions. Works that might otherwise have remained scattered across the ancient world could be brought together, studied, translated, and preserved. And then, somewhere across the long centuries that followed, much of that knowledge disappeared. But how? The popular image is simple. A magnificent library filled with thousands of scrolls is consumed by a single, catastrophic fire, and an enormous portion of human knowledge vanishes in one night. The historical reality is far more complicated. There is no solid evidence for one dramatic event in which the entire Library of Alexandria burned down and disappeared at once. Instead, the institution appears to have experienced a much slower and more complicated decline, shaped by political upheaval, changing institutions, warfare, reduced funding, shifting intellectual traditions, and the gradual destruction or dispersal of collections. That uncertainty is where the real mystery begins. The library was traditionally associated with the Museum, a scholarly institution established under the Ptolemaic dynasty, probably during the reign of Ptolemy I or Ptolemy II in the early 3rd century BC. The Museum was not simply a library in the modern sense. It was a community of scholars. Researchers could live, work, teach, and study there, supported by royal patronage. The collection of texts was part of a larger intellectual project. The Ptolemies wanted Alexandria to become a center of learning that could rival or surpass Athens, and to achieve that ambition, they pursued books aggressively. Ancient sources describe efforts to obtain manuscripts from ships arriving at Alexandria. In some accounts, texts were copied, with the originals retained while copies were returned to their owners. Whether every detail of these stories is accurate is difficult to establish, but the broader pattern is clear. Alexandria wanted books. Thousands of scrolls were gathered there representing literature, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, history, religion, and other forms of knowledge. Imagine what that collection might have contained. Works by authors whose names survive only through later quotations. Scientific observations recorded over generations. Mathematical arguments that never entered the surviving tradition. Medical treatments now known only through fragments. Historical accounts describing civilizations and events from perspectives that disappeared entirely. The loss of a library is not merely the loss of paper or parchment. It is the loss of possibilities. One of the most haunting aspects of Alexandria is therefore not knowing exactly what was inside. Ancient writers provide different estimates for the number of scrolls held in the collection, but the figures vary considerably and should not be treated as precise inventories. The collection was probably enormous by ancient standards. Yet size alone does not explain its importance. What made Alexandria exceptional was concentration. Texts from different cultures and intellectual traditions could exist within the same scholarly environment. Greek literature could be studied beside Egyptian traditions. Mathematical ideas could circulate among philosophers. Astronomical observations could be compared. Geographical knowledge could be revised. The city became a place where information could collide. And sometimes, when ideas collide, something new emerges. The scholars associated with Alexandria produced extraordinary work. Euclid's mathematical writings became foundational to geometry. Eratosthenes calculated an impressively accurate estimate of Earth's circumference. The astronomer Hipparchus, although associated more strongly with the broader Hellenistic scientific world, contributed enormously to mathematical astronomy. The physician Herophilus studied anatomy. The mathematician and engineer Hero of Alexandria later developed mechanical devices that demonstrated the remarkable technical sophistication of the Hellenistic world. Not all of these figures worked directly inside the library, and the institution should not be imagined as a single building where every famous thinker gathered. But Alexandria undeniably became one of antiquity's major centers of intellectual production. Then the political world surrounding it began to change. The Ptolemaic kingdom eventually became part of the Roman world. Alexandria experienced political conflict, civil unrest, and episodes of warfare. One famous episode occurred during Julius Caesar's involvement in Alexandria in 48 to 47 BC, when fires broke out in the harbor area. Later, writers connected this fire with the destruction of books. It is possible that some scrolls were destroyed, but the idea that Caesar's fire annihilated the entire library is not supported by the surviving evidence. The institution, or scholarly traditions associated with it, continued afterward. This is important because it changes the nature of the mystery. There may never have been one moment when the library vanished. Instead, the disappearance may have unfolded gradually. A collection can decline without a dramatic catastrophe. If funding disappears, fewer manuscripts are copied. If scholars leave, fewer texts are studied. If political priorities change, institutions can lose their importance. If a city experiences repeated conflict, buildings and archives become vulnerable. And if texts are written on fragile materials, time itself becomes an enemy. Scrolls decay. Ink fades. Shelves collapse. Libraries require constant maintenance. Without continual copying, even a surviving collection can disappear within generations. This may explain why the library's disappearance remains so difficult to reconstruct. Ancient Alexandria suffered multiple periods of political and social upheaval. Religious conflicts also affected institutions associated with older intellectual traditions. In AD 391, the Serapeum, a major religious complex associated with a library collection sometimes described as a daughter library, was destroyed during conflicts connected with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. But even here, caution is necessary. The Serapeum was not necessarily the original Great Library, and its destruction should not be presented as the single event that erased Alexandria's entire intellectual heritage. The truth appears less dramatic, and perhaps more tragic. Knowledge can disappear piece by piece. A manuscript is copied less often. A scholar dies without students. A collection is moved. A building is damaged. A language falls out of use. A text survives in only one copy, and that copy is eventually lost. No flames are required. No single villain is necessary. Centuries later, this slow disappearance became transformed into legend. Stories emerged of an enormous repository containing the accumulated knowledge of humanity, destroyed in a spectacular catastrophe. That image has endured because it expresses something deeper than historical fact. It represents humanity's fear of forgetting. It also creates fertile ground for speculation. What might have been lost? Some fringe theories imagine Alexandria preserving technologies far more advanced than historians recognize, including forgotten machines, lost energy systems, or scientific discoveries supposedly centuries ahead of their time. There is no reliable evidence for such claims. Yet, the historical record does establish that ancient scholars possessed sophisticated knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, medicine, geography, and engineering. The real, lost knowledge may therefore be extraordinary enough without adding impossible technologies. We know that many ancient works have disappeared. Entire literary traditions survive only through quotations. Scientific texts are known only by references in later authors. Historical accounts have vanished completely. The absence of evidence does not tell us exactly what was lost, and that is perhaps the most haunting feature of Alexandria. We can study the works that survived. We can reconstruct fragments of ancient science. We can identify authors whose writings disappeared, but we cannot create a catalog of books that no longer exist. The missing texts cannot tell us their own titles. They cannot describe their contents. They cannot explain whether they contained revolutionary discoveries or simply another forgotten poem. Somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, there may once have been manuscripts that described places, peoples, experiments, and ideas that no surviving source remembers. Perhaps one lost work contained an observation that could have changed the development of science. Perhaps another preserved an eyewitness account of an ancient civilization. Perhaps most were ordinary texts that would have added small pieces to our understanding of the past. We simply do not know, and perhaps that is the true mystery of Alexandria. Not a single fire, not one night when the lights went out, but the slow disappearance of human memory. The library may have faded through a series of losses so ordinary that no single generation recognized what was happening. By the time later scholars looked back, the institution had become a memory itself. Today, Alexandria has a modern library inspired by that ancient legacy. But the original collection is gone. Its shelves are gone. Its catalog is gone. And the countless voices once preserved on its scrolls are silent. We know some of what disappeared because later writers mentioned it. We know other works existed because fragments survived elsewhere. But for much of the collection, we do not even know what we have lost. And that leaves one question hanging over the ruins and memories of Alexandria. If the ancient world once gathered so much knowledge into one place, how much of that knowledge vanished without leaving even a name behind? Perhaps somewhere, beneath the layers of an ancient settlement, inside an overlooked archive, or hidden within a fragment preserved for centuries without recognition, a small piece of that forgotten intellectual world may still remain. After the lost knowledge of Alexandria, the trail of forgotten books leads us to another ancient city where the ground itself seems to conceal layers of history. Rome. At the center of the modern city, beneath the weathered arches of the Colosseum, another world survives below the level of the arena. Narrow corridors disappear into shadow. Brick walls descend beneath the monument. Stone channels, chambers, shafts, and passages form a hidden architecture that once operated almost invisibly beneath the spectacle above. Today, these underground spaces are known as the hypogeum. They were not a secret library. Archaeology provides no reliable evidence for a vast library hidden beneath the Colosseum, but the idea is compelling enough to ask a different question. If the Romans constructed such an elaborate underground world beneath one of the most famous buildings of antiquity, what else might once have existed within these concealed spaces, and how much of it has disappeared? The known history of the hypogeum is remarkable on its own. When the Colosseum was inaugurated in AD 80 under Emperor Titus, the arena floor concealed a complex system beneath it. Originally constructed largely in wood, the underground apparatus included passages, platforms, lifts, and mechanisms that allowed people, animals, and scenery to appear suddenly in the arena. The audience saw the result. They did not see the machinery. From their seats, a trapdoor could open and an animal could suddenly rise from below. A platform could lift scenery into view. Performers could emerge as if the arena itself had produced them. The underground was therefore the hidden engine of the spectacle. Later, under Emperor Domitian, the subterranean structure was transformed into a more permanent masonry complex. According to the Colosseum Archaeological Park, the underground area extended across roughly half a hectare and included 14 visible lateral corridors arranged around a large central passage. It was a remarkable feat of engineering. But it was not a library. So, where did the story of a hidden library come from? Part of the fascination may come from the extraordinary density of Roman intellectual life surrounding the amphitheater. The Colosseum stood within a monumental landscape containing temples, administrative buildings, imperial residences, warehouses, schools, workshops, and countless other structures. The Roman Forum, Palatine Hill, and surrounding districts formed an immense urban complex where documents, inscriptions, literary works, religious texts, and administrative records circulated. Rome was filled with writing, but most of it has not survived. The Romans recorded laws, military campaigns, property transactions, religious ceremonies, philosophical arguments, poems, letters, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, and everyday business. Much of this knowledge existed on materials that were vulnerable to time. Papyrus could decay, wooden tablets could burn, parchment could be reused, archives could be moved, buildings could collapse. And Rome experienced all of these processes repeatedly. The Colosseum itself was not immune. Its underground structures were badly damaged by a major fire in AD 217, which seriously affected the amphitheater and led to its closure until reconstruction was completed several years later. The subterranean systems were rebuilt and subsequently modified during later periods of the building's use. If documents had ever been stored in temporary spaces beneath the arena, such events would have created obvious risks. But there is no archaeological evidence demonstrating that a major library existed there. That distinction matters. The mystery is not that archaeologists have discovered a hidden library and cannot explain it. The mystery is that the Colosseum's underground world is extensive enough to inspire questions about what might once have occupied spaces that have been altered, reused, buried, or lost. The Roman underground was rarely static. A chamber built for one purpose could later become something else. A corridor could be blocked, a room could be filled, a structure could be incorporated into a later building. And after the Colosseum ceased functioning as an amphitheater, its spaces changed dramatically. By the medieval period, parts of the monument had become occupied by houses, workshops, storage spaces, stables, and other structures. Archaeological and archival evidence shows that the Colosseum's interior was reused in numerous ways from the Middle Ages onward. Some cryptae beneath the seating areas served as warehouses, livestock stables, tool sheds, temporary lodging, and shop fronts. The transformation was enormous. A building designed to entertain tens of thousands of spectators gradually became part of the living fabric of medieval Rome. Walls were modified, rooms acquired new functions, materials were removed and reused elsewhere. The ancient monument became a quarry, a settlement, a religious landscape, and eventually an archaeological site. So, if an ancient document collection had ever existed somewhere nearby, its original context could have been almost impossible to preserve. Yet, there is another reason the idea of hidden knowledge beneath the Colosseum remains attractive. The Romans did have libraries. They existed in temples, private residences, public institutions, and imperial complexes. The famous Library of Celsus, although located in Ephesus rather than Rome, demonstrates the architectural importance that Roman-era libraries could possess. In Rome itself, libraries were associated with major public and imperial projects. The Palatine, for example, was home to important imperial cultural institutions. And this creates a subtle possibility. Perhaps the mystery has been misplaced. Maybe the question should not be whether a library was hidden beneath the Colosseum, but whether the broader monumental district surrounding it contained repositories of knowledge whose contents have largely disappeared. The Colosseum did not stand alone. It formed part of a much larger urban environment. Near it were the imperial palaces of the Palatine, monumental avenues, temples, administrative structures, and other buildings connected to the machinery of Roman government. And beneath Rome, archaeology continues to reveal forgotten spaces. One example is the Heraea Piperataria, a complex of warehouses built under Domitian on the Velia, between the Esquiline and Palatine hills. Archaeological work has exposed underground rooms and traces of buildings associated with the commercial and administrative life of imperial Rome. Elsewhere, excavations have uncovered underground chambers whose purposes remain debated. Rome is filled with them. Some were tombs, some were storage spaces, some were water systems, some were religious or ceremonial environments. Others were simply parts of buildings whose original functions have become difficult to reconstruct. The existence of such spaces makes the ancient city feel less like a collection of ruins and more like a buried landscape. And the deeper archaeologists go, the more complicated the story becomes. The Colosseum itself contains evidence of continual adaptation. The underground machinery changed. Water management systems were altered. Access routes were modified. Different periods left different marks. One particularly intriguing feature is the so-called Passage of Commodus, an underground corridor that allowed emperors to reach the arena without being seen by the public. Archaeological investigations have identified this concealed route beneath the monument. Imagine the psychological effect. Above, tens of thousands of spectators waited. Below, hidden passages carried selected individuals through darkness toward the arena. The architecture was designed not merely to move people, but to control what people could see. That principle is central to the Colosseum. Everything visible to the audience was carefully orchestrated. Everything necessary to create the illusion was concealed. Perhaps that is why stories of hidden libraries feel so natural here. The building was literally constructed around secrets. Its most important mechanisms were hidden underground. Its elevators disappeared beneath the arena. Its performers emerged from concealed spaces. Its rulers could move through unseen corridors. And beneath the spectacle was an entire technical world that spectators rarely understood. But technical complexity should not be confused with a hidden archive. No confirmed ancient library has been identified beneath the Colosseum. No catalog of books has been discovered there. No surviving inscription describes a secret repository of scrolls beneath the arena. That does not make the underground uninteresting. Quite the opposite. It shows us how easily mystery can grow when physical evidence and historical imagination overlap. There is, however, a much broader question. How much ancient written material has disappeared from Rome simply because the environments that once protected it no longer exist? We tend to imagine lost knowledge as something destroyed in spectacular fires. But Rome suggests another possibility. Knowledge can disappear through ordinary decay. A manuscript is stored in a building. The building is abandoned. Rain enters through a damaged roof. The collection is moved. Some texts are copied, others are discarded. A later generation uses the room for something else. Centuries pass. Eventually, there is no visible trace that the documents ever existed. This process may explain why the surviving literary record of antiquity is so incomplete. Thousands of Roman works are known only by title. Others survive in quotations from later writers. Some authors are remembered solely because another author mentioned them. Entire genres of writing have disappeared. We know that Roman intellectual life was richer than the surviving texts suggest because the surviving texts repeatedly refer to works that no longer exist. And this brings us back to the Colosseum. Could an undiscovered archive still lie somewhere beneath the surrounding archaeological landscape? Possibly. But there is no evidence that a secret library is waiting beneath the arena itself. The more defensible mystery is the sheer amount of ancient information that may have once existed within this enormous urban environment and has since vanished. There are also stories of hidden chambers, secret passages, underground repositories, and forgotten Roman archives that appear periodically in popular accounts. Some interpretations connect these stories with imperial secrecy. Others imagine restricted collections accessible only to scholars, priests, or political officials. More speculative theories suggest that Roman authorities concealed important texts underground during periods of war or religious upheaval. Such ideas are difficult to verify, and the archaeological record currently offers no basis for claiming that a vast secret archive was deliberately sealed beneath the Colosseum. Yet, history has a habit of becoming more complicated when excavation reaches another layer. The modern visitor sees the monument from above. The ancient engineer understood it from below. The medieval inhabitant saw something else entirely. The archaeologist sees fragments of all these periods superimposed upon one another. Perhaps that is the real hidden world beneath the Colosseum. Not a single secret room filled with forgotten books, but an archaeological landscape in which countless human activities have been buried beneath later generations. The underground passages once carried animals and machinery. Later, other spaces were occupied, altered, or abandoned. Earth accumulated. Structures collapsed. Stones were reused. And the original relationships between rooms and their contents became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. Today, the underground levels can be visited, and the surviving corridors reveal much about the engineering of Roman spectacle. Yet, even after centuries of excavation, the monument continues to contain unanswered questions about its construction, transformations, and later reuse. Perhaps one day an excavation somewhere in the surrounding archaeological zone will reveal an archive previously unknown. Perhaps a forgotten inscription will identify a building whose function remains uncertain. Perhaps a sealed chamber will tell us something about how Romans stored information, objects, or records. Or perhaps nothing resembling a hidden library will ever be found, and that possibility may be the most appropriate one. Because the real mystery of Rome is not that it possesses a secret library beneath the Colosseum. It is that a civilization capable of producing enormous quantities of written knowledge left behind only a fraction of what it once knew. Beneath the arena, the Romans hid machines, animals, performers, and routes used by emperors. But somewhere beyond those surviving corridors, across the buried layers of the ancient city, countless other things once existed. Books, records, letters, maps, observations, ideas, most are gone. And perhaps the question that should follow us into the next mystery is not whether a legendary library still lies beneath the Colosseum, but something far more difficult to answer. How many rooms of ancient knowledge have already disappeared so completely that we no longer even know where to look for them? From the buried layers of Rome, where hidden corridors once carried people beneath the roar of the Colosseum, the journey now moves far north, to a landscape where silence itself seems to become part of the monument. On the Welsh island of Anglesey, fields and low hills stretch beneath an often changing sky. The wind moves across the grass, clouds gather over the mountains of Snowdonia, and among the green landscape stands a small stone passage leading into the earth. This is Bryn. Today, only part of the original monument survives. The stones are weathered, the surrounding landscape has changed, and the people who built it disappeared thousands of years ago. Yet, when sunlight enters the passage at a particular moment of the year, the darkness inside the chamber begins to glow. The alignment is one of the features that has made Bryn so fascinating. It is a place built around stone, darkness, burial, and light. And like so many prehistoric monuments, it leaves us with an uncomfortable question. What did the people who built it believe they were creating? Bryn is generally understood as a Neolithic passage tomb, although its history appears to be more complicated than a single construction event. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site was used for ritual purposes long before the passage tomb visible today took its final form. At some point during the Neolithic period, a henge monument occupied the location. The exact sequence of construction and modification is complex, but evidence suggests that an earlier ceremonial enclosure was later transformed into the passage tomb. This means that Bryn was not simply built and abandoned. People returned. They changed the site. They buried their dead. They altered the monument. And over generations, its meaning may have evolved. The name Bryn is Welsh for mound in the dark grove, a name that belongs to the much later linguistic history of the landscape, rather than to the people who originally constructed the monument. The original builders left no written name. No inscription tells us what they called the place. No surviving account explains why they selected this particular location. All that remains are stones and traces of human activity. The passage itself is one of the monument's most striking features. A narrow corridor leads inward from the entrance toward a central chamber. Originally, the entire structure would have been covered by a mound of earth and stone, creating an enclosed artificial hill. The interior would have been dark. Outside was the open landscape. Inside was stone, earth, darkness, and the presence of the dead. For modern visitors, entering the passage requires a transition. The light decreases. The walls close around you. The outside world becomes less visible. Then the chamber opens. It is easy to understand why prehistoric monuments of this kind have inspired ideas about journeys, transformation, ancestors, and the boundary between life and death. But interpretation must remain cautious. Archaeologists can establish that human remains were associated with the monument. They can identify construction phases. They can analyze the orientation of the passage. They can study the stones and surrounding features. What they cannot directly recover is the belief system that gave those actions meaning. The people who entered this chamber thousands of years ago left no explanation. Perhaps the dead were placed here as part of ancestor rituals. Perhaps the chamber represented a symbolic passage into another realm. Perhaps the monument served several communities as a place of remembrance. Or perhaps its meaning changed repeatedly over centuries. The alignment with the winter solstice has become one of the most famous features of Bryn Celli. At sunrise around the summer solstice, sunlight can enter through the passage and illuminate the inner chamber. The effect is subtle rather than spectacular. A narrow beam of sunlight travels through the passage, reaching into a space that is normally dark. That relationship between architecture and the movement of the sun has led many researchers and observers to suggest that the builders deliberately incorporated solar alignment into the monument. This is plausible. Prehistoric monuments elsewhere in Britain demonstrate that their builders sometimes paid close attention to the movements of the sun. Stonehenge is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. The orientation of Bryn Celli therefore invites a natural question. Was the sunlight entering the chamber simply a consequence of the monument's orientation, or was the alignment deliberately designed? The evidence strongly suggests intentionality is possible, but the exact meaning remains uncertain. Perhaps the solstice represented renewal. Perhaps the return of the sun was connected with agricultural cycles. Perhaps the light entering the chamber symbolized something about life and death. Or perhaps the builders simply understood the seasonal position of the sun and incorporated that knowledge into their architecture without attaching the symbolic meanings modern people often imagine. The monument itself cannot tell us. That silence is important because prehistoric archaeology is full of places where geometry survives but mythology does not. The builders knew where to place stones. They knew how to create a passage with a particular orientation. They understood the changing position of the sun, but we no longer know the stories they told about those things. Bryn Celli becomes even more intriguing when we consider the earlier monument beneath its history. The site was once enclosed by a henge. Excavations have revealed evidence associated with the earlier phase, including a circle of stones or posts and a central arrangement. The later passage tomb was built within this earlier ceremonial landscape. That suggests continuity. Someone returned to a place already marked as special. But why? Did later communities regard the earlier monument as sacred? Did they know who had built it? Did they understand its original purpose? Or did the physical remains simply create a powerful location that could be given new meaning? This possibility is especially fascinating because prehistoric monuments sometimes outlived the societies that created them. A structure could remain visible for centuries. New generations might encounter it without knowing exactly why it existed. They could nevertheless treat it as significant. In this sense, Bryn Celli may preserve not just one ancient belief system but a conversation between generations separated by time. One group built a ceremonial enclosure. Another transformed the site. Later, people returned to bury their dead. Eventually, the monument fell out of active use. Centuries passed. Vegetation covered the stones. The mound changed shape. The original landscape disappeared beneath later fields. And yet, the monument survived. Archaeological excavation in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed some of its hidden structure, but excavation also introduced a new layer to its history. One of the most famous finds associated with Bryn, Celli is a carved stone sometimes called the pattern stone. It contains a sinuous design that has been compared to serpent-like or abstract forms. Its exact meaning is unknown. Was it symbolic, decorative, religious? Could it represent an animal, a plant, a flowing pattern with a meaning that has been completely lost? There is no definitive answer. The stone itself may once have stood differently within the monument, and its original context is not perfectly preserved. This is another reminder that archaeological objects do not always survive in the positions where their creators placed them. A stone can be moved, a burial can be disturbed, a chamber can collapse, a monument can be rebuilt. Over thousands of years, the original arrangement becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct, and that creates space for speculation. Some modern interpretations have imagined Bryn Celli as an ancient astronomical observatory, proposing that its architecture encoded detailed knowledge of the heavens. The solar alignment gives the idea some basis for discussion, but calling the monument an observatory can be misleading. There is no evidence that prehistoric people used it as an observatory in the modern sense. It may be more accurate to say that the monument appears to have been designed with awareness of seasonal sunlight. Other interpretations focus on the chamber as a symbolic passage. The narrow corridor becomes a journey. The darkness becomes separation from the outside world. The chamber becomes a place associated with ancestors. The sunlight becomes a moment of renewal. These interpretations are compelling, but they remain interpretations. Then there are more speculative theories. Some writers have suggested that monuments like Bryn Celli were part of a sophisticated prehistoric knowledge system stretching across Britain and Ireland, with different sites functioning together as a kind of enormous calendar. Others imagine forgotten astronomical traditions or lost mathematical knowledge encoded into the stones. There is no convincing evidence for a single prehistoric system of this kind. Yet, the broader observation that prehistoric communities possessed substantial practical knowledge of landscape, seasons, construction, and celestial cycles is well supported. The mystery lies in understanding how that knowledge fit into their worldview. For the people who built Bryn Celli, astronomy may not have been separate from religion. The movement of the sun could have been both observable and sacred. The changing seasons could determine agricultural life while also carrying ritual meaning. Death could be biological reality and spiritual transformation at the same time. Modern categories may simply be too narrow to describe their experience. This may be why the monument feels so difficult to interpret. It belongs to a world before written history. There are no ancient texts explaining the architecture. No priests left instructions. No calendar survives. No oral tradition can be traced continuously back to the builders. Instead, we have fragments: stone, earth, human remains, orientation, a carved pattern, and sunlight entering darkness. The monument's surrounding landscape matters too. Anglesey contains numerous prehistoric monuments, suggesting that the island was an important landscape for communities during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Bryn Celli was therefore not an isolated curiosity. It belonged to a broader tradition of monumental construction. Across Britain, communities invested enormous effort into places associated with burial and ceremony. They moved heavy stones. They shaped earthworks. They created passages and chambers. They returned to the dead. Such work required cooperation. People had to organize labor, transport materials, construct structures, and maintain social relationships. A monument could therefore serve more than one purpose. It could honor ancestors. It could reinforce community identity. It could mark territory. It could provide a place for ceremonies. it could connect people to a particular landscape. And perhaps it could do all of these things simultaneously. Then, eventually, the ceremonies stopped. The people disappeared. The monument remained. Today, Bryn Celli is smaller than it once was. The original mound has been reduced. The surrounding landscape has been altered. Some stones are missing, but the central passage survives. Walk through it, and the transition is immediate. The noise of the outside world fades. The walls guide the visitor inward. At the end lies the chamber, and if the timing is right, the sun reaches inside. A beam of light enters a structure built by people who lived thousands of years ago, people whose names have vanished and whose language we do not know. For a brief moment, modern observers witness something the builders may also have watched. The same sun, the same seasonal movement, the same stone walls, but not the same meaning. Perhaps they saw a promise of renewal. Perhaps they were honoring the dead. Perhaps they were marking the turning of the year. Perhaps the light had a meaning so specific to their culture that we no longer possess the concepts necessary to understand it. That is where the mystery remains. We can reconstruct the architecture. We can date the phases of construction. We can identify the burials and analyze the surviving artifacts. We can observe the relationship between the passage and the sun. But the inner world of the builders remains beyond direct reach. And perhaps beneath the soil surrounding the monument, there are still traces waiting to be found. Another burial, another carved stone. Another fragment of the earlier enclosure that could change our understanding of why this place was repeatedly chosen. Bryn Celli is therefore not simply a tomb. It is a surviving fragment of a conversation between prehistoric people and the landscape around them. The stones remain. The sunlight still returns. But the voices that once gave those stones meaning have been silent for thousands of years. And as the light slowly moves through the ancient passage, one question remains suspended in the darkness. What did the builders believe was waiting at the end of the journey? At the northern edge of mainland Orkney, where the land slopes toward the cold waters of Ainhallow Sound, the remains of an ancient settlement sit beneath an immense open sky. Beyond the low stone walls, the sea stretches toward distant islands. Wind moves constantly across the grass, and the landscape feels exposed, almost timeless. Here, on a narrow peninsula near the shore, stands the Broch of Gurness. What remains today is a circular stone ruin, but originally this was a remarkably sophisticated Iron Age settlement. At its center rose a massive round tower, surrounded by additional buildings, defensive walls, ditches, and a complex network of passages. It was not simply a house. It was a fortified community. And yet, despite decades of archaeological investigation, some of the most basic questions remain surprisingly difficult to answer. Who controlled Gurness? Why was such an elaborate settlement built here? And what happened to the people who eventually abandoned it? The story begins more than 2,000 years ago, during the Iron Age, when communities across northern Scotland were constructing distinctive stone towers known as brochs. Brochs are among the most remarkable prehistoric structures in Britain. They are usually associated with northern Scotland and the islands, particularly Orkney and Shetland. Built from stone without mortar, some rose several stories high, with thick double walls containing internal galleries, stairways, and chambers. The Broch of Gurness is one of the best preserved examples. At its center stood the Broch Tower, probably constructed sometime around the 1st century BC or early 1st century AD. The tower itself was enclosed within a larger settlement that developed around it. From a distance, the site might have appeared like a small stone fortress, but once we look closer, the architecture becomes more complicated. The central tower was surrounded by a substantial outer wall. Beyond this were ditches and banks. Inside the enclosure were numerous smaller buildings. The settlement was not merely designed to resist attack, it appears to have been organized for community life. Houses clustered around the central broch. Passages connected different areas. Drainage systems were incorporated into the settlement. There were hearths, storage spaces, and evidence of everyday activity. The people who lived here were not simply hiding behind walls, they were building a permanent community. But why build such an imposing central tower? The most obvious explanation is defense. The thick walls would have provided protection. The narrow entrance could be controlled. The elevated interior would have offered security. The surrounding ditches would have made direct assault more difficult. Yet, archaeologists increasingly recognize that brochs may have served more than one purpose. They could have been homes for elite families. They may have functioned as symbols of status. They could have been communal gathering places. They may have offered protection for people and livestock during periods of conflict. Perhaps the central tower was a residence whose defensive character was simply one part of its design. At Gurness, the surrounding settlement strengthens this possibility. The broch was not isolated. It stood at the center of a community. That suggests hierarchy. Someone may have controlled access to the tower. Someone organized construction. Someone possessed enough authority to coordinate the settlement's resources. But who? The Iron Age peoples of Orkney left no written histories identifying their leaders. No royal inscription names the family who occupied Gurness. No surviving document explains why the settlement was established. We have to infer social organization from architecture. And architecture can reveal power without revealing names. The more carefully we examine the site, the more sophisticated it appears. The outer settlement contained numerous buildings arranged around the broch. Some structures may have been domestic. Others may have served specialized purposes. There are indications of workshops and craft activities. The settlement also had sophisticated drainage. In an environment where rain and groundwater could create constant problems, controlling water would have been essential. Yet, the presence of carefully constructed drains tells us something more. It suggests planning. People were thinking about the settlement as a whole rather than constructing buildings independently. The same is true of the entrances and passages. Movement through Gurness was controlled. Certain spaces were accessible through narrow routes. The architecture created boundaries between inside and outside, public and private, ordinary and protected. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the settlement's defensive appearance was also a way of expressing social order. A massive central tower would have been visible from the surrounding landscape. Anyone approaching the peninsula would have understood that this was a significant place. The structure itself communicated power. And in prehistoric societies without written monuments or monumental statues, architecture could become a language. Stone could announce authority. The sea surrounding Gurness would have amplified that message. Orkney was not an isolated backwater. Its location placed it within a maritime world connecting northern Scotland with the wider North Atlantic. People traveled by sea. Goods moved between islands. Ideas traveled with them. The presence of imported materials at Orkney sites demonstrates that prehistoric communities participated in wider exchange networks. Gurness, therefore, may have been more connected to the outside world than its remote location suggests. Perhaps its position near the water was strategically important. Perhaps it allowed control over a maritime route. Perhaps the settlement was part of a network of communities that communicated and traded across the islands, and perhaps the broch's imposing architecture was partly intended to signal the importance of the people who controlled that network. Yet there is another mystery. The site did not remain occupied forever. At some point, the settlement was abandoned. The reasons are unclear. There is evidence that the broch itself was deliberately dismantled or altered after its main period of use. Later activity occurred at the site, but the original community eventually disappeared. Was Gurness attacked? Did political conditions change? Did the population move elsewhere? Did the settlement lose its economic importance? Or did social changes make the broch itself obsolete? Archaeological evidence can sometimes reveal destruction, but abandonment is more difficult to interpret. People leave buildings for many reasons. A settlement can become vulnerable to changing coastlines, economic shifts, disease, political conflict, or changes in trade. Sometimes there is no dramatic event at all. A community simply moves. Generations later, the reasons are forgotten. This uncertainty has encouraged more imaginative interpretations. Some modern theories have portrayed brochs as mysterious structures built by an unusually advanced or unknown civilization. Others have imagined them as ancient observatories, ritual centers, or structures designed around astronomical principles. The architecture certainly demonstrates impressive engineering. But there is no convincing evidence that Gurness was built by a lost civilization or served as a sophisticated astronomical observatory. Its construction can be explained through the skills of Iron Age communities living in northern Scotland. That explanation, however, should not make the site seem ordinary. The engineering remains extraordinary. The walls were built from carefully selected stone. The tower's internal structure required detailed planning. The builders understood how to distribute weight through thick masonry. They created internal stairways and galleries. They constructed drainage systems, and they organized an entire settlement around the central structure. This was not crude construction. It was specialized architecture produced by people with knowledge accumulated through generations. One of the most intriguing aspects of Gurness is the contrast between strength and domesticity. The walls appear defensive, but inside were hearths, household objects, food remains, and evidence of ordinary life. Children may have lived here. Families may have cooked here. Craft workers may have produced tools and ornaments. People may have gathered around fires at night while the sea wind moved outside the walls. This is where archaeology becomes unexpectedly intimate. The broch is often imagined as a monument, but for the people who lived here it was home. They experienced winter storms. They stored food. They repaired tools. They cared for animals. They raised children. They buried their dead. The monumental architecture was simply the environment of everyday life. And yet, the central tower must have carried symbolic significance. It was far more imposing than an ordinary dwelling. Perhaps it belonged to an elite household. Perhaps it served as a communal refuge. Perhaps both interpretations are correct. The social structure of Iron Age Orkney remains difficult to reconstruct, but the architecture suggests that not everyone occupied the same position. The effort required to build a broch would have demanded coordination. That coordination itself implies leadership, but leadership does not necessarily mean a king. It could have been a powerful family, a local chief, a council, or a community organized around kinship and shared authority. Without written records, the names and political structures remain invisible. We can see the architecture of power. We cannot see the people who held it. The landscape surrounding Gurness offers another clue. The site sits beside the water, facing a broad maritime environment. For people dependent on farming, fishing, livestock, and exchange, the sea was not a boundary. It was a road. Boats could connect communities faster than overland travel across rough terrain. A settlement positioned beside an important waterway could therefore control access, trade, and communication. Perhaps Gurness grew wealthy because of that position. Perhaps the broch was built to protect a community that had become increasingly important. Or perhaps the location was chosen because the sea itself offered security. The archaeological evidence cannot yet distinguish between these possibilities. And then there is the question of violence. The massive defenses naturally suggest warfare. But prehistoric fortifications do not automatically mean constant conflict. Walls can protect status as much as bodies. A fortified settlement may discourage attack simply by displaying strength. The message could have been, this community is organized. This community is wealthy. This community can defend itself. That may have been enough. Gurness, therefore, becomes more than a fortress. It becomes a statement carved in stone, a community announcing its presence to the surrounding world. Then, eventually, the statement fell silent. The settlement declined. The central structure was no longer maintained in the same way. Buildings collapsed. Stones were reused. Grass covered the ruins. Centuries passed. The people who built the Broch became part of a distant archaeological past. Today, visitors can walk through the remains and trace the same entrances used by people more than 2,000 years ago. The sea still lies beyond the settlement. The wind still moves across the peninsula. The basic geography has changed surprisingly little. But the human world has vanished. There are no surviving names for the families who lived here. No written account describes their daily lives. No document tells us what they feared. No inscription explains why they built the tower. All that survives is architecture. And perhaps that is why Gurness remains so compelling. The Broch is both familiar and mysterious. We understand how stone walls can be built. We understand why people might seek protection. We understand the importance of food storage, drainage, trade, and shelter. Yet the exact social meaning of the tower remains uncertain. Was it a fortress? A residence? A symbol of status? A communal refuge? A place where political authority was concentrated? Or did its meaning change depending on who stood inside it? Perhaps the answer was never singular. Perhaps Gurness served as home, stronghold, meeting place, and symbol simultaneously. That possibility may be closer to how prehistoric people actually experienced the world. Modern categories separate military architecture from domestic architecture, political centers from religious places. But ancient communities may not have drawn those boundaries so sharply. A powerful household could be a political center. A defensive tower could also be a home. A gathering place could also be sacred. And a settlement beside the sea could be both community and gateway. Gurness leaves us with fragments of all these possibilities. Yet the final chapter remains missing. We do not know exactly why the settlement was abandoned. We do not know whether its final years were peaceful or violent. We do not know who held authority within the central tower, and we do not know whether the people who left believed they were abandoning their home forever. Perhaps they expected to return. Perhaps they moved because another settlement had become more important. Perhaps conflict forced them away. Or perhaps the society that built the Broch simply changed until the old structure no longer had a purpose. The stones remain, but their original voices do not. And as the wind moves through the ruined passages of Gurness, the most haunting mystery may not be how such an impressive fortress was built. It may be why a community capable of creating something so enduring eventually walked away from it. What happened on this remote Orkney shore that caused the fires to go cold, the doors to close, and the great stone tower to become a monument to people whose story has almost entirely disappeared? Beyond the windswept islands of the north, where the stones of Gurness still stand above the sea, the journey now moves toward a very different landscape. In western Anatolia, the hills around modern Aden rise above a broad, fertile plain. The climate is warmer, the valleys wider, and the landscape has been shaped for thousands of years by rivers, agriculture, trade, and expanding cities. High above the modern settlement lie the remains of ancient Tralleis. At first, the ruins appear fragmented. Weathered stones emerge from the earth. Massive architectural blocks lie among vegetation. Walls and foundations suggest buildings that were once far more imposing than anything visible today. But Tralleis was not an insignificant town. It was an important city of ancient Caria and later the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, positioned within a region where different cultures, religions, and political powers repeatedly overlapped. And among its remains are traces of religious and ceremonial activity that raise a difficult question. How much of the sacred landscape of Tralleis can we still reconstruct when so much of the ancient city has disappeared? The name Tralleis appears in ancient sources, and the city developed into an important urban center after the conquests of Alexander the Great transformed the political landscape of Anatolia. During the Hellenistic period, the city came under the control of different rulers and kingdoms. Later, it became part of the Roman world. Its location was one reason for its importance. Tralleis stood in the fertile Buyuk-Menderes region, an area connected to important routes crossing western Anatolia. Agriculture supported the population. Trade connected the city with surrounding communities. And political changes repeatedly altered the city's identity. Religious life would have been woven into all of this. Ancient cities were not divided neatly into religious and secular zones in the way modern cities often are. Temples could dominate public spaces. Sacred rituals could be connected to political authority. Festivals could involve entire communities. Priests could possess influence. Offerings could circulate through sanctuaries. And the construction of a temple could communicate the wealth and ambitions of an entire city. At Tralleis, however, reconstructing the exact organization of its sacred spaces is difficult. Much of the ancient city lies beneath later occupation, or has been damaged over centuries. Stones were reused, buildings collapsed, earth accumulated. Modern development transformed parts of the surrounding landscape. The result is an archaeological puzzle made from fragments, a column base here, a carved block there, a foundation disappearing beneath later soil, an inscription whose original building has vanished. The sacred complex, as reconstructed by archaeologists, is therefore less like a single preserved monument and more like a collection of clues. What did the original sanctuary look like? Which deity or deities were worshipped there? Who controlled the rituals? And how did religious practices change as the city passed from Hellenistic to Roman rule? These questions become especially interesting because Tralleis existed through multiple cultural transformations. The Hellenistic world did not simply replace earlier Anatolian traditions. Instead, different religious practices interacted. Greek gods could be worshipped in Anatolian settings. Local traditions could continue beneath new political systems. Roman authorities could identify their own gods with existing deities. Religious identities could overlap rather than replace one another completely. That makes sacred archaeology particularly difficult. A temple's architecture can reveal a great deal about construction techniques and cultural influence. But architecture alone cannot tell us exactly what worshippers believed. An altar does not record the prayers spoken beside it. A statue does not preserve the emotions of the person who offered incense. A temple foundation does not explain why one god was chosen over another. The stones preserve the framework. The human experience has largely disappeared. This is where the mystery of Tralleis becomes more subtle. There is no need to imagine a secret civilization or supernatural force. The unknown lies in the ordinary lives and beliefs of people who left behind only fragments. Consider the rituals that might once have taken place here. A worshipper approaches the sanctuary. Offerings are carried through the entrance. Incense rises into the air. Priests perform ceremonies whose precise words are now forgotten. Musicians may accompany festivals. Animals may be sacrificed in some contexts. Food may be prepared and distributed. Visitors may travel from surrounding communities to participate. None of these activities would necessarily leave a complete archaeological record. Organic materials disappear. Wood rots. Cloth decays. Food leaves only traces. Human voices vanish immediately. What remains are the structures that once framed those experiences. The ancient city itself provides another layer. Tralleis became known for its monumental architecture, public buildings, and skilled craftsmen. Ancient sources associate the city with important artists and builders, and its urban development reflects the prosperity that the region could support. The famous Ut Goslar, or Three Eyes, visible at the site today, are among the most recognizable remains of Tralleis. These enormous surviving arches belong to a monumental complex associated with Roman-era baths or gymnasium architecture, illustrating the scale of construction once possible in the city. But the sacred landscape existed within this broader urban world. Religion, politics, education, athletics, and public life were closely connected. A sanctuary could stand near civic buildings. A gymnasium could have religious associations. A public festival could combine athletic competition, ceremony, and political display. This interconnectedness makes it difficult to isolate a sacred complex from the rest of the city. Perhaps the most important question is not where the sacred area began and ended. It is how religious meaning moved through the entire urban landscape. Ancient cities were places of movement. People traveled from houses to markets, from markets to temples, from temples to public squares, from the city to surrounding sanctuaries. Every route could become part of social and religious life. Tralleis occupied a landscape where mountains, rivers, and fertile plains shaped human movement. The geography itself may have influenced sacred traditions. Mountains could become associated with divine presence. Rivers could acquire religious significance. Springs could become places of healing or ritual. Groves and caves could become sacred spaces. Even when the architecture disappears, these natural features may preserve clues about ancient beliefs. Yet, separating genuine evidence from later interpretation is essential. Modern fascination with ancient sacred sites often encourages theories of hidden knowledge, astronomical alignments, secret priesthoods, and forgotten technologies. Tralleis has sometimes been drawn into broader claims about lost ancient wisdom, but there is no solid evidence that its sacred complex concealed advanced technology or a secret civilization. The real archaeological questions are more grounded. How was the sanctuary organized? Which communities used it? What rituals took place there? How did religious practices evolve under different rulers? And what happened when the old religious institutions began to lose their authority? The last question is particularly important. The Roman period brought enormous political and cultural changes. Later, Christianity transformed the religious landscape of Anatolia. Temples associated with older traditions could be abandoned, converted, dismantled, or simply left to decay. Buildings lost their original functions. Stone was reused. Sacred objects were removed. The landscape itself acquired new meanings. This process happened across the ancient Mediterranean. A temple could become a quarry. A column could become part of a wall. A sacred statue could disappear. A sanctuary could be forgotten beneath fields and later settlements. At Tralleis, centuries of transformation make it difficult to identify every phase of religious activity. Some remains belong to different periods. Some structures were rebuilt. Some architectural elements were moved. The archaeological record, therefore, resembles a palimpsest. One civilization wrote over another. Then another wrote over that. And with each layer, traces of the earlier meaning became harder to recover. This is perhaps why the Tralleis sacred complex remains so intriguing. It represents not one civilization, but a sequence of worlds occupying the same landscape. Hellenistic rulers, Roman administrators, local Anatolian communities, merchants, farmers, priests, craftsmen, soldiers, travelers, each would have encountered the city differently. For a priest, the sanctuary may have been the center of existence. For a merchant, it may have been one landmark along a trade route. For an ordinary resident, the sacred buildings may simply have been part of the city they knew every day. For an outsider arriving during a festival, the same space could have appeared completely transformed. Archaeology gives us the buildings. It does not tell us which of these experiences was most common. There is also the possibility that some sacred traditions were never monumentalized. Not every ritual required a temple. People could worship at household shrines. Small offerings could be placed in natural locations. Private religious practices could leave little archaeological evidence. The surviving sacred complex may therefore represent only the visible portion of religious life at Tralleis. Beneath the monumental architecture was a much larger world of personal belief. Perhaps this is where some of the city's greatest mysteries remain. Who were the people whose names appear in inscriptions? What did they ask from their gods? What did they fear? What did they promise? What did they believe happened after death? A dedication carved into stone can preserve a name for 2,000 years, but it cannot preserve the private thoughts of the person who commissioned it. Even the largest monument can become strangely silent. The stones remain. The purpose survives only in fragments, and sometimes the fragment raises more questions than it answers. Future excavations may reveal additional inscriptions. A buried foundation could identify a temple. A previously unknown statue might reveal the identity of a deity. A sealed deposit could provide evidence of ritual practices, or new discoveries could challenge interpretations that currently seem convincing. That is how archaeology works. One discovery can rearrange an entire landscape of assumptions. For now, Tralleis remains a city whose importance is easier to establish than its full religious story. We know that it occupied a strategic and fertile region. We know that it developed into an important Hellenistic and Roman center. We know that monumental architecture once dominated the city. We know that religious activity formed an important part of urban life. But the exact shape of its sacred world remains incomplete. The mystery is not necessarily hidden in a secret chamber. It may be scattered across fragments of stone, buried foundations, broken inscriptions, and objects whose original positions have been lost. Perhaps the most revealing discovery is still beneath the ground: a forgotten sanctuary, a ceremonial deposit, a damaged inscription waiting to be read, or perhaps nothing dramatic will ever emerge. Maybe the ancient religious world of Tralleis will remain permanently incomplete, preserved only in scattered evidence. And perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. Sacred places were created to connect human beings with forces they believed were larger than themselves. The people who built them expected their rituals, prayers, and offerings to carry meaning beyond the ordinary world. Thousands of years later, only the stones remain. The prayers are gone. The ceremonies are gone. The people are gone. But the question remains beneath the ruins. Standing among the surviving blocks of Tralleis, looking across the fertile landscape that ancient worshippers once knew, it is difficult not to wonder what they experienced when they entered these sacred spaces. What did they see? What did they believe was listening? And somewhere beneath the earth, could there still be one undiscovered fragment capable of revealing what the ancient people of Tralleis believed they were speaking to? From the sacred landscape of Tralleis, where layers of belief accumulated over centuries, our journey now moves westward to a very different monument shaped not by monumental temples, but by earth, stone, and the quiet logic of defense. In the rolling countryside of County Carlow, Ireland, fields rise gently toward the Blackstairs Mountains. The landscape appears peaceful now, green and open beneath the changing Atlantic sky. Yet, on a low hill near the village of Rathgall lies a remarkable prehistoric enclosure whose scale hints at a community far more organized than its quiet surroundings might suggest. This is Rathgall Stone Fort. From the ground, much of the site can seem understated. There are banks, ditches, stones, and broad circular outlines partly softened by centuries of vegetation. But viewed from above, the plan becomes clearer. Several concentric defenses surround a substantial interior, creating a monument that was not simply a place of refuge, but an organized settlement with a remarkably long history. And the first mystery is not why people came here. It is why they kept returning. Rathgall is generally understood as a prehistoric hill fort or stone fort, but its story reaches back much further than the later Iron Age period with which such sites are often associated. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of occupation extending over many centuries, with activity beginning during the Bronze Age and continuing into later prehistoric periods. That long sequence is important. Rathgall was not simply constructed, occupied for a generation, and abandoned. The site appears to have changed repeatedly. People rebuilt. They modified the defenses. They occupied different areas. They buried objects. They established structures inside the enclosure. And eventually, the settlement declined. When archaeologists encounter a site with such a long history, the obvious temptation is to search for a single explanation. Perhaps Rathgall was a fortress. Perhaps it was the residence of an elite family. Perhaps it was a ceremonial center. Perhaps it controlled an important route through the landscape. But prehistoric communities rarely fit neatly into one category. A place could be a home and a stronghold. A political center could also be a ceremonial gathering place. A settlement could serve as both refuge and symbol. Rathgall may have combined several of these functions. The monument's physical structure provides the first clues. The fort is surrounded by multiple banks and ditches, creating concentric defensive zones. These would have required considerable labor. Earth had to be moved. Stone had to be collected. Boundaries had to be planned. The interior had to be organized. Such work suggests that the people associated with Rathgall were capable of mobilizing substantial communal effort. But construction on this scale also raises a social question. Who organized the labor? A small household could not have built and maintained such extensive defenses alone. Someone had to coordinate people. Someone had to control resources. Someone had to decide where the fort should be built and how it should be expanded. Perhaps Rathgall was associated with a powerful local family. Perhaps a chieftain or elite group lived within the enclosure. Or perhaps the fort represented the collective strength of a broader community. The archaeological evidence can suggest hierarchy, but it cannot provide the names of those who ruled. No royal inscription survives. No written chronicle describes the people of Rathgall. The monument is therefore a structure of power without a surviving record of the people who exercised it. Inside the defenses, archaeologists have discovered evidence of buildings and domestic activity. This is significant. Rathgall was not simply an empty fortified enclosure. People lived here. Fires burned inside its structures. Food was prepared. Objects were made. Animals were kept. People moved through the settlement carrying out the ordinary routines of life. The fort therefore becomes less like a monument and more like a vanished town. Imagine approaching Rathgall during its occupation. From a distance, the defensive banks would already have been visible. The entrance would have guided movement toward the interior. Beyond the outer defenses, another boundary would have appeared. Then another. The effect would have been deliberate. The settlement was protected by layers, Crossing from the outside world into the central area required movement through increasingly controlled spaces. Such architecture could have practical defensive value, but it could also communicate status. The stronger the enclosure, the more important the settlement might appear. In prehistoric Ireland, hill forts and enclosed settlements could occupy prominent locations within the landscape, making them visible from considerable distances. Rathgall's position may have been important for precisely this reason. It occupies a landscape between upland and lowland environments, not far from routes connecting different parts of the region. Control of movement may have mattered, so might access to agricultural land. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the location was chosen not simply for strategic reasons, but because the landscape itself already held meaning. Prehistoric people did not necessarily separate geography from belief. A hill could be a landmark, a defensive position, a gathering place, and a sacred location simultaneously. The surrounding mountains, rivers, fields, and horizons could all form part of how people understood their world. If Rathgall had ceremonial importance, however, the evidence is much harder to interpret. Some prehistoric structures contain clear ritual deposits. Others contain burials. Some have carefully placed objects that appear to have been deliberately deposited. At Rathgall, archaeological discoveries include evidence that suggests more than ordinary domestic activity. Yet, the exact meaning of individual deposits remains uncertain. A carefully placed object could be an offering. It could be refuse from a ritual. It could be something hidden for practical reasons. Or it could simply be part of everyday activity that modern observers interpret incorrectly. This is one of archaeology's most persistent problems. An ancient object does not come with a label explaining why it was placed where it was found. Context matters, but even context can be ambiguous after thousands of years of disturbance. And Rathgall has experienced a great deal of time. Generations passed. Structures collapsed. New buildings appeared. Old defenses were modified. Later communities may have encountered the remains of earlier inhabitants without understanding their original purpose. The site may therefore contain several different stories layered over one another. One of the most intriguing aspects of Rathgall is the evidence for its early occupation. Some of the earliest phases date to the Bronze Age, a period when metalworking, agriculture, exchange, and social organization were developing in complex ways across Ireland. Bronze objects were valuable. Their production required knowledge and access to raw materials. Connections between communities allowed objects and ideas to travel. A settlement capable of participating in such networks could become important. Rathgall's archaeological record suggests that it was not an isolated community cut off from the wider world. Objects recovered from the site provide clues to craft production and exchange. Evidence of metalworking is particularly significant. Bronze Age communities did not simply possess metal objects. Some had the expertise to manufacture them. That requires specialists, raw materials, fuel, tools, and social systems capable of supporting skilled production. If Rathgall was involved in this activity, it may have been more than a defensive settlement. It could have been a place where wealth and technical knowledge accumulated. And wealth creates another reason to build walls. A community with valuable goods has something to protect. Perhaps the fort's defenses reflected genuine concern about conflict. Perhaps they protected stored resources. Perhaps they protected people and livestock. Or perhaps their greatest function was psychological. A heavily defended settlement could discourage enemies before a battle ever began. The walls did not need to be tested to have value. Their existence sent a message. This place is organized. This place is protected. This place matters. That message may have been directed toward neighboring communities as much as toward potential attackers. The question of warfare, however, remains difficult. Fortifications do not prove that constant warfare existed. Prehistoric societies could build defensive structures because conflict was possible, not because conflict happened every day. The existence of a fortress tells us that people understood vulnerability. It does not tell us how often they experienced violence. And there are other mysteries hidden in the site's later history. At some point, Rathgall's importance declined. The settlement was not occupied continuously in the same form forever. The structures changed. Some areas were abandoned. Later activity altered the archaeological record. Why? Perhaps political power shifted elsewhere. Perhaps regional trade routes changed. Perhaps environmental or agricultural conditions altered the settlement's prospects. Perhaps a new community gained influence. Or perhaps the inhabitants simply moved as part of ordinary social change. Archaeology rarely provides a single dramatic explanation for abandonment. That uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some fringe theories have suggested that major prehistoric forts such as Rathgall were constructed by mysterious outside peoples, lost civilizations, or groups possessing knowledge supposedly beyond the technological abilities of their time. There is no reliable evidence for such claims. The archaeology points instead toward prehistoric communities with sophisticated but entirely plausible knowledge of construction, metallurgy, agriculture, trade, and social organization. Yet, recognizing a human explanation does not make the site less impressive. If anything, it makes Rathgall more remarkable. The people who built it had no modern machinery. They had no written architectural plans in the form we would recognize. They relied on tools, experience, cooperation, and generations of accumulated knowledge. And they transformed the landscape. They created concentric defenses that still remain visible thousands of years later. Perhaps the most haunting part is the contrast between what survives and what has vanished. The earthworks remain. The stones remain. Fragments of buildings remain. Objects buried in the soil remain. But the people who designed the fort are gone. We do not know their names. We do not know their language with certainty. We do not know the stories they told around their fires. We do not know how they explained the world beyond the horizon. We can only reconstruct fragments. And those fragments become particularly interesting when we consider the possibility that Rathgall was not merely a defensive settlement, but a place where social authority was concentrated. A large, fortified center could have served as a meeting place. Communities from surrounding areas may have gathered here. Goods could have been exchanged. Disputes could have been settled. Rituals could have taken place. Political alliances could have been formed. In such a setting, the walls would have represented more than physical protection. They would have marked a center, a place apart, a place where ordinary rules may have been temporarily transformed. But there is no surviving written account to confirm this. That is the persistent difficulty. The archaeological evidence is substantial enough to show that Rathgall mattered. It is not sufficient to tell us exactly why, and perhaps that is why the site feels so mysterious. It is not mysterious because it defies archaeology. It is mysterious because archaeology brings us close to a society without allowing us to enter it completely. We can stand where they stood. We can follow the outline of their defenses. We can examine the objects they left behind. We can reconstruct parts of their buildings, but we cannot hear the conversations that once filled those spaces. We cannot know what a child thought while looking over the walls. We cannot know what a leader promised during a gathering. We cannot know whether the fort's inhabitants felt safe behind its defenses or constantly feared what lay beyond them. And we cannot know what finally persuaded them to leave. Today, Rathgall is quiet. Grass covers the earthworks. The surrounding fields have returned to ordinary agricultural life. The great activity that once took place here has disappeared almost completely, Yet the shape of the fort remains impressed upon the landscape. It is a kind of archaeological memory. The people are gone. The buildings have largely vanished. But the earth still remembers where they placed their boundaries. Perhaps future research will reveal more about the settlement's inhabitants, its craft production, its connections with neighboring communities, or the reasons for its changing importance. Perhaps another excavation will uncover an object that transforms the interpretation of the site. Or perhaps the most important answers have already disappeared forever. Standing among the banks and ditches of Rathgall, it is difficult not to wonder what the builders wanted the fort to say. Was it a warning to outsiders? A home for an influential family? A center of trade and craftsmanship? A place of ceremony? A refuge during uncertain times? Or something that combined all of these functions in ways we no longer understand? The stones cannot answer. The earthworks remain silent. But beneath the grass, fragments of the ancient settlement still lie in darkness. And somewhere among those buried layers may be the missing piece that explains why Rathgall became important, and why, after centuries of human activity, the people who built this formidable stronghold finally disappeared from the landscape.